Look, folks, I've been podcasting since 2005, and while the thought of doing a panel-styled episode like this has occurred many times, I've never done it. But honestly, now after having finally done it, I'm going to do it again. Howdy. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, this is a really fun, unique episode, and I'm really pleased with the way that it turned out. Here's what's in store for you. There are two parts to this episode. Part one, I interview our panelists, which are 4 journalists from Backstory Magazine, about what is one thing that they gleaned that was important to them in their articles. And their articles, of course, are from issue 51 of Backstory, which is our Oscar issue. So we are going to satisfy my need for horse's mouth information because each of these journalists have interviewed the editors, directors, animation directors, cinematographers, and of course, screenwriters that make up our Oscar issue. Of course, if you're a Backstory subscriber or thinking of becoming one, don't worry, we're not giving away the whole article. What's interesting is our articles are so in depth that we did focus on one element of the article, but there's still plenty of other information in the article itself. And since this is our Oscar issue, for most of the films, you could also read the entire screenplay in the magazine as well. So that is part one. Part two is a roundtable discussion where we all get together and we analyze the 10 screenwriting nominees. So Best Original and Best Adapted. Now, this is an interesting year for it because the screenwriting nominees, it's not really clear who's going to win. There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of opinion, and we are giving our opinions, but nobody knows for sure because of the writer's strike. The WGA awards themselves will be after the Oscars this year. And writing is also a tricky category even in a normal year because there's a differential between the nominees of the WGA writers and the Oscar writers. Because of course, the WGA writers have to be WGA members. So I gotta say, this was a fun episode, really informative, packed with a lot of information. And I hope that you write in and tell me what you think of it or reach out on social media because I'm hoping you're going to enjoy it, but I would love to hear your feedback. And of course, I hope that you will consider supporting my passion project, Backstory Magazine. If you've never read us, you could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. We have a free issue there, so you could test drive us. And of course, if you like what you see, and I hope you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. So now, without any further ado, let's jump right into this episode. We are going to start with the one-on-ones. If you really want the roundtable discussion, just skip to about the middle. We're going to start with the one-on-one. So we're going to start with Associate Editor of Backstory Magazine, Danny Munso, and then we're going to go to our other journalist participants today, which include Claude Chung, James White, and Jeff Bond. For the Backstory Magazine viewers on our YouTube page, you could see that good old Danny Munso has entered the chat.
Thrilled to be here.
Danny Munso is Backstory Magazine's associate editor, and he is just a longtime friend, and we bounce stuff off each other all the time as journalists. Danny is the right hand of Backstory Magazine, without a doubt, and he's also quite the writer, and he wrote a bunch of articles this issue. So we're going to start with American fiction. One of the things that we traditionally do is when we get a really in-depth interview, like we did for American Fiction with Cord Jefferson, I think it was like over 4,000 words, it became our cover story for our 50th issue. And we were really proud of it because having a writer writing on the cover of our 50th issue was perfect. If you subscribe, there's still going to be a lot more in the article. We're not going to spoil the whole thing for you, but tell us what you want to focus on.
I thought we'd focus on the first scene because if for people who have not seen the movie or need a refresher, Monk, who's played by Jeffrey Wright, he's a professor, he's in class, and he writes the N-word on the whiteboard. And a white student, young white woman, objects to it, says that this really offends her, and his response is, with all due respect, Brittany, I got over it. I'm pretty sure you can too. And Cord and I talked about that scene, though should say that American Fiction is adapted from a novel, and this scene is not in the novel. In fact, in the article, we talk about the many, many digressions that he takes from the source material, but he wanted to use it as a bit of an icebreaker to set the tone for the entire film because it's both an uncomfortable scene and a hilarious scene. And he wanted to let the audience know that it's okay to laugh at this. There's going to be other uncomfortable stuff in this movie that you're allowed to laugh at, but also there's going to be a lot to think about as well. And made several comments throughout the interview where he's worried that people are afraid to laugh at racial issues these days. And he wanted the first scene to kind of be a tone setter for the entire film.
That's what was so brilliant about it. I mean, like, Cord has one of the great adaptations here with American Fiction because, not everything about the book was translatable to film, and not everything about the book made it cinematic. But what Cord did in his adaptation was he did make it cinematic. For our podcast listeners who've heard the 16th annual screenwriting nominees Q&A that we did, where we had 7 out of the 10 Oscar nominated films discussing their screenplays, one of the things we talked about was, the use of a secret. And, in Cord's movie, obviously the secret is that he's written this book that he doesn't want to put his name on, and he's reacting to people around him all loving the book and going crazy over it, and he's losing his mind like he's in a Twilight Zone. But one of the things I brought up to Cord was one of the secrets from the book that he also didn't translate was that Monk's father had a secret family. And that was completely left out of the movie as just like another layer of this complicated family and the ideas that they have secrets because his brother was in a marriage that was false and he was secretly gay and now he's living his best life out in the open. So, I mean, secrets play into it. And it was an interesting adaptation and fascinating to hear Cord talk about what he kept and what he didn't. But that's a great part of the movie is starting right there at the beginning in which there's no question what kind of movie American Fiction is going to be when you set the tone like that right from the beginning.
One of the best scenes of the year. The first time I saw it was at a predominantly white screening, and that got a lot of laughs from the predominantly white audience. And there were a few people looking around saying, is it okay that we're enjoying this so much? And I think that's exactly what he wanted people to feel in the theater. So mission accomplished.
So, of course, as we were talking about the opening of the film, it also makes sense to talk about the end of the film. And I know it wasn't an homage to Lord of the Rings, Return of the King with the multiple endings, but there's some different paths taken, there. And they all wind up leading again to that moment of, between the brothers realizing that, living your real life is the best life. What could you tell us that Cord said about the ending?
Well, there's way less endings here than there was in Return of the King, for the record. For people that have seen the movie, this is delving into a little spoiler territory. The movie has Monk going on stage to accept this award on his alter ego's behalf. And then we see a series of different kind of endings for different kinds of genres, because the final reveal is that he's on a movie set for the adaptation for the book he wrote under the pseudonym. But it actually ties into one of the best scenes earlier in the film where he's starting to make this up in his office and the characters come to life in front of them. He's at the typewriter and these two characters are out in front of him playing the scene out, this cliched gangster scene, deadbeat dad scene that we see played out. He wanted to include that scene particularly because he wanted to do the alternate ending of the finale. And he thought if he didn't include the first scene at the typewriter, that the different endings would come out of left field. He wanted to add a little surrealism to the movie. So that's why that first scene was included, which is funny because it's one of the best scenes in the movie. And the main reason it's there is to set up the quote unquote fake endings.
It's a great movie. I was so glad that not only did it get nominated for screenwriting, it also got nominated for Best Picture. It really deserved to be. Of course, 4,000 plus words. Danny wrote a lot more, so you could see the rest of the article in the issue. You can also read American Fiction, the script in Backstory Magazine. We have all the scripts of the award season stuff, kind of one of the biggest collections in place. Yes, they're floating around somewhere on the internet, but you could read them right easily in our magazine, and they look absolutely gorgeous. We are going to move on to our next film. One of the things that Danny is really known for at Backstory is he has a great grasp of the animated genre sector. And so usually most, if not all, of the animated films that we write about in Backstory, Danny takes it upon himself to write those. And Danny hit 3 of them. So let's start right at the beginning. We'll go in alphabetical order here. So let's talk about Elemental. Danny, what could you tell us from your Elemental article that's like a favorite beat or something that you'd like folks to know about?
For people that follow Pixar closely like I do, their storytelling process is endlessly fascinating to me. All animated movies are made different than live action, but Pixar especially is so different. And filmmakers throughout the years, I've been lucky enough to do, I think, every Pixar movie since Backstory started. They're so open about talking about all the mistakes they make along the way. Usually a 5-6 year process. I think Elemental might have been 7 with the pandemic thrown in there. It was longer than usual. But so I say that because they found the ending on Elemental relatively early in the process. Maybe at Pixar, throughout the life of a film, it'll go through 8 story reels, which is basically the movie in storyboard form
with temp tracks for the
with
actors
temp
usually.
tracks, with temp acting and all that. And usually the movie is solidified around the 6th reel in terms of it's starting to look like, okay, this is what the version we're going to see in the theaters. I know we're talking about home video releases now, which is a thing of the past mainly, but Pixar was very good about putting some of these early story reels on their home video releases, and you can see how different they were from the final film. And so,
just for the record, they're sometimes referred to as animatics. About once a year, if it's a 6-year project, they're doing their latest rough cut, and then they're reassessing it, and they really do change a lot from cut to cut.
They do. And so the writers that Pixar brings on, most of them are from outside animation. And that was the case with the 3 writers for Elemental. They're not used to this process. It's very foreign to them. But the ending was found on Elemental. And if people have seen Elemental, there's a great last beat of the film where Ember is leaving on the boat with Wade, and she does a ceremonial bow to her father, and he returns the bow. And that's a callback to something in the middle of the movie where the dad says that when he was moving his family, emigrating them to this town, that he did the bow to his father, and his father didn't return the bow because he was disappointed in him for leaving home. And that comes directly from director Pete Sohn's own family. The movie's very personal for him. It's about his parents who left Korea, moved to New York. They ran a bodega. I think they still run a bodega in New York, actually, to this day. And he was spitballing with the writers, Kat Lickell and John Hoberg, who are a married couple. And he just was telling them a story one day, not intended to be in the film, about how when Pete's father left Korea, he did a ceremonial bow to his dad, to Pete's granddad, and his dad didn't return it. And that crushed Pete's father. And the second Pete told that story, Kat Lickell, one of the writers, said that's the ending of the movie. That needs to be in the movie. And it was such a eureka moment that they announced to the entire Pixar staff that they had found the ending to Elemental on the 4th story reel, which is at least a couple years early than normal. And that was the first story reel they worked on. That was one of the first things they fixed when they came on board the film. So they worked backwards for years from that ending to get to that ending.
And I love endings that are reverse engineered into the rest of the story because it has a really organic feel. So that's fantastic as well.
Yeah.
Of course, when you're reading these in Backstory Magazine, aside from there being the rest of an entire article to read, that was just one cool part of it. You could also read the screenplay in its entirety. And yes, these things are bouncing around the internet in various places, but we have them all collected in one place, and you could read them in Backstory Magazine. As we continue into our look at Oscar-nominated films, things are going to get a bit spicy and saucy as we get to Nimona. Danny, there's a lot of ground to cover here. Tell us what your initial takeaway was as you kind of peeled back the layers between the 2 stories at hand, which are the making of Nimona and then Nimona itself.
I encourage anyone who has not seen Nimona to, 1, see the film on Netflix, and then 2, read our article and read other articles about how this film even exists, because it is kind of a modern miracle of filmmaking that this got made at all. And to take people inside baseball a little bit, it was my intention to avoid some of the drama that had gone on in getting this film made, not to shy away from it, but I thought that coverage of that aspect of the story was taking away from the actual film itself and the amazing content that's inside of it. And so when I interviewed the directors, Nick Bruno and Troy Quaid, they basically would not allow me to do that. They wanted to talk about the controversial stuff, and so much so that they think that talking about that stuff is the reason the film ended up the way it is. To them, the 2 are linked. So there is no talking about Nimona's story without talking about the story of how this thing got shut down and made.
It was a graphic novel first.
Graphic novel first, very popular graphic novel by N.D. Stevenson, brilliant graphic novel. And it's been set up, I think, since 2015 at Blue Sky Studios, which is owned by Fox. They made the Ice Age films and the Peanuts movie and things like that. And of course, we all know in 2019, Disney bought Fox. which included Blue Sky Studios. Disney already owns two animation studios, Walt Disney Animation and Pixar. They had no need for Blue Sky, and they shut Blue Sky down 2 years later, and Nimona along with it. And eventually Megan Ellison and Annapurna swooped in, saved Nimona, released it through Netflix, but not without a lot of controversy, as the directors claimed that the first screening they did with the Disney execs, they pulled the two aside, which is rare for a screening with 50 something people in it or whatever. And the quote that they gave me was, "Let's talk about the gay stuff." And that was the first thing the Disney execs said to them. They knew at that point they were in trouble. The project was shut down not much longer after that.
Just to put it in context for people, though, I believe this was also around the time where horrible Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was very empowered, was promoting the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And it was at a time where Disney as a company, because of their theme park in Orlando, was starting to battle a little with the state of Florida. But at this time when the film was shut down, I think Disney was trying to just get out of a battle. And ultimately, they did do the right thing. But in the early days of it, they were trying to just not have a political problem in Florida at all. And as a company, they were kind of really shying away from content that had LGBTQ plus issues within it. So I guess it makes sense at the time. It's embarrassingly horrible to hear.
Yeah.
And, it's a miracle that the film was able to get out of there. And Disney did, of course, eventually stand up to the state of Florida and has continued to, and has been better about not shying away from LGBTQ plus content.
The problem with Disney's choice is that this is a story you cannot tamp these things down with. For people that don't know, the graphic novel is hugely important in the LGBTQ plus community. N.D. Stevenson identifies as non-binary and transmasculine. The title character in the story is a shape-shifting being who doesn't identify as one thing. And the lead character in the story, Ballister, is a gay man in a gay relationship with his rival. This is not something you can tamp down. The LGBTQ plus community sees Nimona as this important text and now film. And for Disney to try and avoid that altogether, it was either you cancel the movie, which they did, or you make it. So after Disney shut the film down, they first decided whether they wanted to keep going. They both decided they did. They ended up finding Megan Ellison. Read all about it in the story, but they had to go to an entirely different animation studio. Every piece of animation they had at Blue Sky could not be used. They had to re-rig everything. Basically, they took over the script and some of the storyboards.
Wow.
Everything else was a top-down redo. But the interesting thing about that is because of why the film got canceled, it made them take a look at the story they were telling, and they were honest with themselves, and they thought, as much as this is a gay story, that maybe they weren't going far enough with it. So they actually took inspiration from that and leaned into that relationship between Ballister and Goldenloin, which is his rival, Knight. They leaned into it even more because that's something the graphic novel doesn't explore to a great extent. And they wanted to basically call Disney's bluff and not only make it the central relationship in the film, but make it an even bigger part of the film than the cut Disney saw.
Of course, you could read the script for Nimona in Backstory Magazine along with the rest of Danny's article, which has a bunch of other stuff because all we were talking about was the making of the movie. And of course, Danny gets into the characters and some of the big story moments as well in his article. Okay, so next up we have Robot Dreams in our Oscar animated category. And this is kind of a wild one because it is Oscar nominated, and it's truly a part of showing the impact that word of mouth screenings and early screenings could have with voters, because Robot Dreams is not officially released. It had a brief qualifying Oscar run in 2023, which is how it got Oscar nominated. But you said it seems like these days it's not coming out till possibly May of 24, right?
Coming out in May. There is some screenings next week, starting next week, I believe on March 6th. I believe just for a week. I don't know how wide that release is, so people check their show times. I highly, highly encourage people to number one, see the film, but see it in theaters. It
Yeah.
legitimately has some of the best sound in a movie in 2023, I think.
Wow.
We'll avoid spoilers for the most part because we don't want to ruin it. The actual making of this film is really fascinating. The director is actually a live action director named Pablo Berger. He's a Spanish director. He found this graphic novel that he really connected to called Robot Dreams and wanted to make it in that same style the artist did and make it a 2D animated film. He shopped for the movie around for years. Finally found a partner in Cartoon Saloon. For people who don't know who Cartoon Saloon are, they're the Irish animation studio behind Wolfwalkers, Secret of Kells, The Breadwinner. I think they made 4 features and 3 of them have been nominated for Oscars. Pablo said that the night he made the deal with Cartoon Saloon, he went to sleep that night and dreamt about his movie being nominated for an Oscar.
Wow.
Which is funny because Cartoon Saloon had nothing to do with this movie, the finished version anyway. When he signed that deal, it was right before the pandemic hit. And once COVID hit, Cartoon Saloon moved to remote work. They had a backlog of stuff. They just couldn't fit Robot Dreams into their schedule anymore. Pablo was devastated. Really, I mean, Cartoon Saloon is one of the best animation studios in the entire world, probably the best one in Europe at the very least. And so he was crushed. He is a bit of a maverick. Talking to him is really fun. And he decided that he still wanted to get his movie made. And rather than take it to another animation studio, that he would basically build his own pop-up animation studio. And so him and his animation director basically outsourced, found all these independent animators in Europe that were willing to come work with them in person, set up literally a pop-up animation studio that is no longer there in a warehouse, and animated the movie in person over a 2-year period. This was during COVID. Most professional animation studios had been working remotely. His deal with the animators, if you wanted to come work on this movie, you had to wear a mask, but you had to work in person.
Interesting.
And so they were like the only animation thing in the world going on at that point that was actually working in the same room together. It's just a brilliant film. I don't want to give away the story, but it's very emotional. It's very impressive that he made a 90-minute film out of this graphic novel. And like I said, the sound is incredible.
You could, of course, read the rest of Danny's article in the latest Oscar issue, and there's plenty more to talk about with the story in the film that does get into spoilers. And we do not yet have the script for Robot Dreams because the movie hasn't officially been released, so the script has not officially been released, but we think that we are going to get it soon. So the great thing about being a digital magazine is that we're able to update ourselves when we do get new stuff. So you could always check back because we have like a specific article that has the repository of all of our Oscar scripts. So all you got to do is look in there. Well, you know, the final animated to talk about is Danny's interview with Miyazaki for The Boy and the Heron. Please tell us all about that amazing interview you were able to score for us.
I saw The Boy and the Heron, one of the best movies of the year, one of the best movies of Miyazaki's career, which is really saying something. I saw it in September, and we put in at a film festival here in the Bay Area, and I put in a request then to speak to him, and we are now talking one day before March, and that request has yet to be answered. But yeah, Miyazaki does not do interviews, unfortunately. So
damn it, Munso.
Yeah. We've been trying for months. It turns out that when you're the greatest animation director of all time, you don't need to do interviews. So,
you know what's funny though? I don't see it as a need. No one needs to do an interview. It's for your legacy. It's to set down a
That's the problem, is that his legacy is already
I mean, his legacy is way established, but
his legacy is set in stone.
We're still looking into options with other people that worked with him because, you know, look, nobody needs to do an interview. What it does is it helps other filmmakers around the world to get better understanding of your process so they could apply these things to their process. I respect Miyazaki. So obviously, if the brother didn't want to do an interview, that's fine. But hopefully we could get somebody.
It's not just us.
It's not just us. It's not just us.
I'm sure he loves backstory. In fact, I guarantee he does.
Yes, right. As it turns out, of course, Miyazaki is probably our biggest subscriber and supporter. And because Apple does not release any subscriber data to us whatsoever, we would never be able to prove that in a court of law. Danny also wrote a story for this Oscar issue on the short film War is Over. Tell us about that.
I love animated short films, so I always try and get one or two of these in our Oscar issue. This one kind of hit all my buttons. It was written and directed by Dave Mullins, who used to worked at Pixar for 25 years. He did the short film Lou. If there are any really diehard Pixar fans out there. It is also based on the song Happy Christmas, War is Over by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It is produced by Sean Ono Lennon. Sean also co-wrote the story with Dave. This hit kind of everything I want in an article. And then it turns out they used an entirely new animation process to make the damn thing. So it ended up being probably my favorite piece I did for this whole issue.
What's something that really resonated with you from the piece that you want to tell us about?
When they were making this was the time Peter Jackson was making Get Back, the docuseries he did for Disney Plus on the Beatles. And Sean, I think, called Peter, asked him what he thought of the project. At this point, they had the story. They had nothing else. Not sure how they were going to get it made, any of that stuff. Just kind of wanted Peter Jackson's opinion on it, as you do. And Peter loved it so much. He's obviously a massive Beatles fan. It was also right after the war in Ukraine started. So John and Yoko's message of peace was especially resonant at this time. And he wanted to be involved, offered up his animation studio, Weta Digital, to animate the film. And once Peter Jackson was involved, producer Brad Booker, who I also spoke with for the article, he's been in the film industry for 30 years. So he has a lot of contacts. One of those people is named Richie Bainheim, who is a member of Avatar's visual effects team. I think he's won multiple Oscars for working on the first two Avatar films. And so they were just having a casual lunch one day, and he said, "Oh, we got Peter Jackson's involvement with War is Over, and we're going to have Weta do the animation." And Richie had worked with Weta on Avatar. And he said, "Oh, if you guys are going to do that, then you have to shoot the performance capture on the Avatar stage." And so he went to Jim Cameron and John Landau, and this incredible, unique animation style that Brad and Dave came up with, where they were going to shoot the film performance capture and then have Weta animate over that. They shot it not only where on the Avatar stages after Way of Water was shot, but they shot it with the Avatar performers. So if people have watched the behind the scenes Avatar stuff, either online or on home video, there's this guy, Kevin Dorman, who kind of leads the Avatar performers, and he is the lead in War is Over as well.
Unfortunately, at this moment in time, while the short was online, it can't be viewed, but we expect either in the lead up to the Oscars or right after, it probably will be viewable again sometime soon.
It was viewable in theaters they do the short film program every year. I believe that just ended. So you could see it. It did have a brief theatrical run at the end of 2023. They have a deal with someone. They were kind of cagey about it. It will be coming out this holiday season. They're not only releasing the film, I believe they're doing a new version of the single. They're doing a book based on it. So they're planning a pretty major rollout. Their intention was to do this all in 2023. And it just didn't happen. They barely made the deadline for the Oscars as it was. So now 2024 will be this huge Happy Christmas, War is Over extravaganza.
One cool thing is, as a Backstory subscriber, you have access to our archive, which is all the issues we've ever published. And of course, they're all digital, so they're easy for you to get to. And, if you just type in Danny's name, you'll see a plethora of articles, not just on these kind of big animated movies, but Danny's also extensively covered the Star Wars animated series for us, ranging from Rebels to Bad Batch. And hopefully we're going to have a new Bad Batch article because there's a new season going on right now, which we would probably do at the season's conclusion. Danny did amazing articles for Star Wars Visions Volume 1 and Volume 2, where we were literally able to get a hold of almost all the directors through translators and get info about them, because that's what we love doing, is going behind the scenes. So Backstory subscribers, there's a lot more animation coverage for you from Danny. So yes, it's our Oscar issue, but the Oscars are going to be over, and we know that. So we always put extra stuff in the issues that is not Oscar related, that is just typical of what we do, and we try and do every issue. So Danny has two other stories, and we're always adding stories as well, but he has two other stories that are already published. One of the other pieces that Danny does a lot for us is The Blacklist. And of course, that's Franklin Leonard's program, The Blacklist, which is looking at the best unmade scripts of the year. And Danny has a good one for us. Tell us about your Blacklist script. And a cool thing that we do is not only do we interview the screenwriter who made it to the Blacklist with their script, and a lot of these get heat after they enter the Blacklist, but we also publish the screenplay in its entirety as a way of getting it out there. So you could also read the entire script along with Danny's article. Tell us about the latest Blacklist entry.
It's a script called Bad Boy, written by Travis Braun, and it has the distinction of not only being on the Blacklist, it was voted number one, which means it got the most votes in 2023 for unproduced scripts. About 5 pages in, you can see exactly why it was voted number one, because I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. And obviously, if you're a subscriber, you can read the script as well. The script is about a dog who loses his family and is adopted by a serial killer. The entire script is told from the dog's point of view. So the main character in the story is not the dog's owner, it is the dog himself. And it is incredibly unique, incredibly scary. It's a horror film. It is not a family film. It is one of the most original things you will ever read, and you must read it.
So obviously there's the rated R comedy Strays that came out last year that's absolutely hilarious. And, you know, they had dogs talking the whole movie. Here, I'm curious, does the dog have an inner narrative at all that we could glean in on?
Yeah, no, that's one of the best choices he made, is that there isn't any of that. It's not a talking dog movie. You don't hear the dog's thoughts at any point. The dog is basically treated like a character that cannot speak. And so you glean the emotion from the scene direction, from what the dog does, from how the other characters interact with the dog. He and I had quite a chat about if he ever thought about going down that road, and he confessed that he did briefly, but then at the end of the day, he did not want it to be like Homeward Bound, that Disney movie from the 90s. He referenced that specifically, where Michael J. Fox is one of the voices of a dog, and great movie, by the way, but not appropriate for this material. And that's one of the amazing things about the script, and that's why it's so brilliantly written. And if anyone is interested in writing, you have to read how he wrote this, because you're basically writing a lead character who's on every page of the script who does not speak. And it truly is remarkable, and easy to see why it was voted number one.
Well, so obviously one of the characteristics of the Blacklist itself is that once scripts make it onto the list, it gives them heat, and they go from being the best unproduced script of the year to somebody swiping up the rights and going and making it. Is there been any movement on that we know of?
It is being made, yes. I don't think the companies have not been announced. There is a director attached. It is on its way to being made.
Well, you could read the article and the full script in the latest issue. Another non-Oscar article in the issue that we're really proud of is something that you know comes to my core as a young theater kid. I always loved to have theater pieces in the magazine, and we had Leslie Headland, playwright, who's also a screenwriter in the magazine, for her latest play. Danny, tell us about it.
So Leslie Headland, one of my favorite writer-directors. She's made a couple feature films. She was the co-writer, co-creator, director of the first season of Russian Doll on Netflix. She is also writing and directing the next Star Wars live-action series, The Acolyte. So getting her in this was really exciting, because her play Cult of Love is playing at the Berkeley Rep Theater, which is by me here in the Bay Area. I know Leslie as a screenwriter and director, but she was actually a playwright before she did any of that stuff. And she started this series of plays in New York called The Seven Deadly Plays, where she took one of the seven deadly sins and used that as a jumping off point for writing a play. She wrote the first 6 in, I think, a 5-year period. They all got made either in LA or New York. It took her 8 years to write the 7th and final one, which is this one called Cult of Love, which is based on the sin pride. And the reason it took her so long, it was because she knew what the story was going to be, and it was going to be very autobiographical, and had to deal with her ultra religious upbringing in her family, and putting all that in a play, and putting all that laid bare on the stage to how her family reacted to her coming out as gay, and how that affected her relationship, not only with her siblings, but with her parents. There is a gay couple in this script. They face judgment from the entire family, and how that does not vibe with the family's religious beliefs. Despite the way I'm making it sound, the play is actually very funny. Even more amazing, it's full of musical performances because Leslie grew up in a family where they had guitars and pianos around the house and they would perform religious songs together. And that's what this family does in the play as well.
But it's not a musical per se, right?
Not a musical, but there's maybe 5, 6 full song performances that are pretty rousing, to be honest. And I grew up in a religious household as well. And it reminds me that even if you don't believe in all those beliefs anymore, that the songs are all bangers. So they're all great songs. Whether you want them to be catchy or not, they're catchy.
Well, good. So people could read the rest of your article, learn more about her creative process and more about what she went through to write her play. So, thanks for that article.
We should also say that there is a little tease of the Acolyte at the very end for Star Wars fans.
Well, look, Danny, your articles were awesome. You did a fantastic job of covering both the Oscar and non-Oscar stuff alike. So thanks for joining us for this one-on-one segment. And of course, we'll see you again in our group roundtable, which is a little later on.
Can't wait.
And now we have with us good old Claude Chung, another backstory journalist. And Claude and I go way back, all the way to USC Film School. And it was fun when Backstory began because I turned Claude into a journalist overnight with his first published pieces. Claude's also a writer, and in other parts of his career, some have speculated a serial killer, or sorry, there's no proof, so person of interest, I guess you could say. For our Oscars issue, Claude wrote the article on Past Lives. He also wrote the first article on Past Lives last spring when the movie came out. But when the movie came out, the WGA strike was on. So we were only able to interview Celine Song as a director, not as the actual writer that she is as well, because she wrote and directed the film, which was a Sundance film that's, gone all the way to a Best Picture nomination and, of course, Best Screenplay nomination. And Past Lives recently cleaned up at the Independent Spirit Awards, winning some top honors as well. But so, Claude, you wrote the piece, and, Celine was also in our 16th Annual Screenwriting Nominees podcast. So tell us something that you gleaned from this article when you finally got to interview Celine as a writer that stood out for you.
Yeah, so the first time was kind of a more general thing, and as a first-time director, which is ripe for questions. But it was interesting when I got to specifically the writing part, and I was lucky enough to get a chance to look through the actual script first. And anyone who reads the article can do that for themselves because they can access the script there too. But what struck me when I started going through the pages was that she had written the Korean dialogue, which makes up the majority of the script, in both Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet, and in English. I mean, usually when you have a script that's mostly in another language or significantly another language, they just write it in English and have a little annotation saying this is Russian or this is Korean, this is Chinese, whatever like that. But to have it there in both languages, in every dialogue block throughout the script was striking. And it struck me that maybe she was trying to kind of emulate the effect that audiences would have when they see the movie, because then they're going to getting two languages at the same time, except one's listening and one's reading. But here's both reading. So I asked her about it, and she talked about how because the bilingualism isn't just a feature where you just happen to have a character who's from another country. It's very central thematically to the whole story. A protagonist who has these two parts of her life, her identity, and the childhood sweetheart and her husband, and her relationships with each man. It manifests that split within her. It was important for her to really understand how central that aspect of it was. And so that's why she wrote it all in there. When you read the article, you'll be able to see it. The dialogue is Korean and English, Korean and English. So it's all throughout the script.
And it's interesting because what you just held up on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page for people that are watching this as a Zoomcast, she uses a slash for the dialogue rather than using the Final Draft dual dialogue feature. She could have had a stream side of the page that was Korean and one that was English, but she actually put it in the dialogue formatted area and then basically has it twice, which I thought was really interesting.
It's almost like when you read a foreign language textbook, they write it in one thing and right next to it the other, so you can see it like tracking as opposed to like just as a script feature. It adds to that effect to the reader where they're directly tied. It's not just a format question. One of the things that struck me too, and it kind of ties into some of the questions I asked her about how it was to write something so specific and personal to her. It's not just an immigrant story. It's very specific. Was something that happened to her that she turned the premise into this whole great movie about. You take the specific story And you wonder, as a first-time filmmaker, are you going to get it made? Are people going to have an interest in it? And if you write your script that's not just mostly in another language, but then it's right there, she's emphasizing it with the two different languages on virtually every page. How many people are going to read that and think, no, I'm not interested. But it's a credit to an outfit like, Killer Films, Christine Vachon and Pam Koffler's company. That didn't frighten them at all. They're always up for like something, a creative voice and whatever form it takes. So, she just had faith in the story and might as well be as truthful and honest to the themes of the story as possible and the characters. And so that manifests itself here with this bold choice.
And it's interesting because it wasn't something that she was doing for investors. Like she was trying to raise money. She did it for herself. And I could see that because to my memory, there's also not a note in the screenplay that even addresses it. It just happens on every page. Yeah. So it's not like she says in the beginning, please note, every single scene will be in both, Korean and English. No. And it wasn't like she picked scenes that were specifically supposed to be in Korean with English subtitles at the bottom of the screen. It is literally every scene of the entire screenplay. So it's kind of like a interesting thing to do on the page. Honestly, I could see how some executives would be confused by it and unsure of what language the film itself is supposed to be spoken in. And she didn't have a note. So, I mean, it's a testament to how strong her story was and how strong her characters were that, people didn't need a note. They didn't need it to be explained because the story was going to resonate no matter what language you told it in anyhow.
Because it's not just a little thing that you just pat and gloss over like, okay, that's over. You go through the script and you get used to seeing this thing. So even though, most people reading the script aren't going to speak Korean, and so they're not going to understand how to read that part. Having their just kind of like on subconscious level, like registers, and they get just used to reading the English part only, but always having in their mind that it's a reflection of another language and another part of the character, And she talked about how the bilingualism comes into effect in that scene when she first brings Hae-sung over to her apartment to meet her husband. Yeah. And it's funny, Celine Song had made sure that the actors had never met before that scene, so it was very fresh for both of them. And, Arthur, the husband, says, 안녕하세요, in kind of like broken Korean. And Hae-sung like says hello, in kind of wobbly English. That's just another way that the bilinguals manifested themselves. So, that's why it was so central to all of it. And I respected that creative choice.
Yeah. And then thematically, of course, the protagonist is the bridge between those two worlds. So she understands perfectly both sides of what the two characters are saying, although those two characters don't always understand what the other side is saying. It was a great choice, and that's a cool thing to pick out of your article. There's, of course, other things in your article as well that I know people will dig. So thanks for doing a great piece.
Thanks.
And now we have with us one of our fave journalists, good old David Somerset. Or do we? Last time I checked, David Somerset is the alias for James Bond in From Russia with Love. And I guess the question would be right off the bat, are you James Bond?
Truth be told, Jeff, no, I'm not James Bond. My name is James White. I am a journalist. I'm not making that bit up, but mostly I was using David Somerset because I had some sort of professional engagements back in my homeland. America is now my adopted homeland, but back in my English homeland.
Oh, right. You're from that little island off Europe. Yeah. Go on.
That one. Yeah. That little one that used to rule the entire world and now really doesn't. It's basically just that I had some sort of professional work that I was doing over there, and I didn't want to compete with anything that I already had going along. So I decided to use a pseudonym for backstory. So this is technically my coming out party.
This is your unveiling.
Yeah.
You've been doxxed as an agent. Now you're in danger.
David
Somerset is in danger. But what's funny is everybody in the magazine knows who you are. And occasionally one person who will not be named will occasionally use David Somerset. They're like, yeah, I got a question about David's article. And I'm just sitting there like, who the hell is David? What are they talking about? And then it's like, oh yeah, right. This person who knows you're James White somehow still refers to you as David. But okay, yes. You started writing for us in 2012, which is when Backstory Magazine launched. So it made sense that you were doing that back then. Now, I guess we're going to rewrite your bio to say James White. And James White wrote a whole bunch of the Oscar articles, some of them even with me, we co-wrote. And we're going to start right off the bat with Spidey. You and I co-wrote Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the piece with the writers. We interviewed Philip Lord, Chris Miller, David Callahan, the three writers, and that has been Oscar nominated for Best Animated Feature. I ask everybody else what's a part of the article that was really important to them, that they remember was kind of interesting and shed light on the process. For me, I think it was interesting because it showed a little bit about how they really make these things, in which Lord Miller, who did the first movie, they wrote on the first movie, they realized that they needed some help to prepare for the second movie. In our article, Callahan really talks about how they always knew that Miles Morales was technically bitten by a spider from a different universe, universe 42, which is different than his home timeline. And so Dave Callahan, knowing that, and they weren't sure what they were going to do with it, he was able to break the concept that there is a universe that does not have Spider-Man. And that there's an alternate Miles Morales, as we know, which is the final reveal of that movie, who is really playing a villain in that universe. And I thought that was interesting because it shows that in the process of years, they knew early on that they needed to start working on Across the Spider-Verse when the first movie was either just about done or wasn't even entirely done and released. And so it's good planning on their part, because that ending is really a great moment to show how complex things have gotten for Miles's character.
It is, and it's almost more impressive when you think that as it was originally conceived, Across the Spider-Verse was only going to be one movie, until they realized they had so much movie, so much story to fit into one thing that they literally they couldn't fit it all in one thing. So they made the decision to split it up into Across and Beyond, which will be coming out when it comes out. They still haven't set a formal release date for that one. But yeah, the whole cliffhanger really technically didn't exist until they just wrote so much. They just couldn't fit it all in one movie. So it's even more fascinating that they had to decide on a point to break the story up. And that is such a fantastic point about which to break it, because you're left hanging in this moment thinking, oh my God, what is going to happen next?
And it's always good because when you realize that that's the point at which you're going to end your movie, I like writers who are able to reverse engineer the rest of their screenplay around their ending. There's no one way to do it, write however you want, but there are writers who would swear by sometimes not knowing their ending and discovering it through those early drafts that they're racing through. But I also find the folks who have either outlined or have done some rough generalization about what the beginning, middle, and end is going to be, once they know that they're going to have a killer ending like that, it helps them to write other parts of their screenplay all leaning up towards that moment. And so, the stakes are there because obviously the family is very close, and now Miles is missing his correct family. And in this universe, his dad is also deceased as well.
The thing that really impressed me is the fact that that ending is a very dark ending, but it's very much earned. It's very much built up to in that way, and you really appreciate what happens. And the fact that it almost blew my mind in some ways that they actually had it technically planned out from the first movie. Now, they didn't know exactly what they were going to do, but they introduced the idea that the spider in Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse, is glitching. So it clearly comes from a different dimension. It's just then using that for that ending is great.
It's a great example of setup and payoff. Absolutely.
It really is.
Well, so James, I kind of said, that was one of the things that really struck me about the article. What was something that you really liked about it? Of course, anybody who reads the article in Backstory Magazine, there is still plenty to get into, including the ability to read the entire screenplay, because we have a repository of all the award season screenplays in one place for you. But what was another part of the article that you really dug?
Always these movies are changing. Animated movies as a whole, changing a lot all the way through the process until they absolutely can't. They actually have to get it out the door. With this one of the fascinating things that Lord and Miller and Callahan talked about was the fact that there was an entirely different villain in the process. The Spot, who is his sort of the main antagonist, technically Miguel O'Hara, you could call the other main antagonist, at least for Miles.
Yeah.
But the fact that there was a whole other villain storyline. Now, they wouldn't go into it. I can understand that. They're probably going to try and keep that powder dry until the next movie, or they'll just use it for something else. But the fact that there was a whole other villain arc developed, and we still got the incredibly top quality movie that we got using what they had without that villain, that really impressed me. I have to say that was fascinating.
It was also a problem in screenwriting in which there were too many antagonists. Because obviously Spider-Man 2099 was the guy that's trying to do good for the world, but is really doing bad, as Miles points out. And the Spot was there as comic relief that's growing into a threat. So to have a third villain on top of that, or a villain that served a different purpose, was going to battle with those other two concepts. It wasn't entirely clear to me if all three were in a draft at one time. That I don't remember that all three were there. I think that Spot was there maybe as a joke and then disappeared. And then they had some new ideas for him that really outweighed the importance of what they were trying to do with the other villain. And that's why they kind of narrowed it down to two. And when I say villain, like, an antagonist is somebody that's standing in front of your protagonist's goals. And that's what Spidey 2099 is basically doing. So he is an antagonist and he's not an antagonist. And they're classically writing him as in which, a good antagonist doesn't know that they're an antagonist. They think they're doing good for the world. So it's a complicated film. And so that'll bring us to the next interview, which I did not co-write with you. You did it all on your own, James. You interviewed co-director Kemp Powers for Across the Spider-Verse. Totally different article, totally different interview. What was something that really stuck with you from that article?
The one thing that really sort of stuck with me from that one was the fact that probably one of the most beloved sequences and moments in the movie, which is Peter and Gwen sitting underneath the clock tower, hanging with their spider powers underneath the clock tower, and then swinging through the city, having this huge conversation that had to absolutely earn its place into the movie. There was a time where it was absolutely going to be cut out. It was going to be sliced out because there was too much talking. And in animated movies, they don't always love long scenes where there is a lot of talking. They want gestures, they want movement, they want vibrancy. But this sequence, survived. They rewrote it a few times. They made it work, and it's turned into one that's in almost all the trailers and has been on a poster. It's kind of crazy to think that something that was going to be absolutely deleted made it into one of the most memorable parts of the whole movie, one that was used to sell the movie.
We call this section in the magazine with all of our Oscar coverage, Oscar lessons. And I think the interesting thing there, the lesson, is that if you have something that you can't fully justify, but you feel like it belongs and deserves to be there, it's always great to reassess how you could reinforce it and make it important enough to stay. So just as you said, revising, rewriting, doing everything they could to keep it, actually, I'm sure made it a better scene from its earliest iteration and, improved upon it greatly in the process. Whereas they could have just cut it when it wasn't working for probably legit reasons why it wasn't working. But it just shows that, nothing is written so much as rewritten, even though this was an article about Kemp directing it, that the continued polishing, the continued kicking the tires and trying to make things better, I think is really important.
It's just a real sort of celebration of that process, of something that producers, the writers, and of course the directors have really got down pat on these Spider-Verse movies. I mean, the fact that Kemp, he was there start to finish, figuring these things out. Everyone had a voice. He even talked about as basically having a brain trust, a little bit like the way Pixar has a brain trust, but him, Phil Lord, Chris Miller, Joaquin, Justin, the other directors, every single day getting together to discuss, to really tear apart the movie, put it back together, to find out what works and what doesn't work. Honestly, the results speak for themselves, though. You look at the final movie and you think, yes, this was made by people who really, truly cared about what they were doing and were rigorously putting everything to the test.
Not only did James write articles about Oscar animated films, he also wrote about live action films, and let's get into those right now. First up on the list is Anatomy of a Fall. We interviewed Arthur Harari, and James and I co-wrote this article. James, I'll let you start first because I have something that's more oriented towards the end. What was the takeaway of yours from the article?
One of the most fascinating things I found out was that they actually had a journalism character who interviews the Sandra character at the start and then ends up trying to spin it into something that helps her career, basically tries to sell some aspect of her career that she was closer to Sandra than anyone suspected. There's a lot of talk about her past affairs, her past LGBTQ stuff, and that whole character continued through at least a couple of drafts, but they realized that they really didn't need her because they had enough input from other journalists commenting on the case, commenting on what happened on the whole murder trial, everything like that. And what they ended up doing was turning that character into a journalism student who's actually interviewing Sandra about writing in the first scene, which we see, and then just basically didn't need the rest of it. They also worried that it was kind of a cliche, which I thought was sort of a fascinating peek at their process and how they were thinking, we will need this at the start, but then as they went through various drafts, they realized actually it doesn't work. We'll cut it out entirely, almost entirely anyway.
Yeah, and it also makes sense because for all the loose ends that they try and throw in the film as to reasons why she either did or did not do the murder and things that they say about her character, at one point the prosecutor's trying to insinuate that she was also trying to pick up on the student, that she might have a romantic interest, even though nothing's ever played out. And so that was like just another one of the interesting unanswered threads because it never could be answered. And that was, Arthur Harari, who co-wrote it, obviously his partner, Justine Triet, she directed it and co-wrote it with him. One of the things that was interesting was that when the pandemic began, he was having trouble with a movie already. And so he was just in this frustrated place where it was a movie that Arthur directed. And so him coming up with a new idea and breaking it with Justine while caring for their children, it just kind of gave them something to do in the early days of the pandemic. And it's why it has a very lived in feel. You know, Arthur was also in the 16th annual Screenwriting Nominees podcast, which you could also hear. And we talked a lot about the truth and basically the subversion of truth, the misidentification of truth, trying to have a both sidesism to the truth where everything's true at once, but it can't be. And so I think the thing that struck me that was really interesting that I honestly did not clock the first time I watched the film until Arthur said it was that when Daniel, their son, is recounting his last conversation with the father at the end, and this is all part of the subplot where maybe it wasn't murder and the father killed himself, it's done in Daniel's voice and not his father's voice when we see these flashbacks. And Arthur explained that it was something that originally they weren't even fully aware of until editing, because point of view of Daniel's flashback is already a point of view imprint on the truth. It makes it more subjective. But putting his father's words in Daniel's actual voice puts another layer of it. And as Arthur described, they went for a lip sync of it to make it match perfectly. And I found that really fascinating. There's a lot of other things to learn from this article. And of course, you could read the entire screenplay in our repository of screenplays. And that is an interesting screenplay too, because it notates what parts are specifically in French and in English, because that's also an element of the film's plot as well.
That's a fascinating part of it. I mean, just that switching between languages and knowing which part needs to be in which language and how that affects her sort of thinking and how that affects her mental state and how things are gotten across and the possibility in a legal sense for there to be gray areas and everything like that because of literally lost in translation. It's fascinating.
And look, you know, I love the film. It became a part of our cover. We referenced the house on the cover as a crime scene. We actually licensed artwork from a really talented European artist, Boriana Aina, and she had actually drawn this beautiful representation of the house, kind of as like a doll's crosscut section where you could see inside. And then we turned it into a murder scene, you know, on the cover of Backstory issue 51, our Oscars issue. And we, you know, associated the 10 best screenwriting films with it. And then there is a differential between the screenwriting category and the best picture category. And that differential is, of course, Killers of the Flower Moon. So we put Lily Gladstone as one of the suspects on our cover as well for her character Molly. So everything's there. It's a really fun cover. And of course, thanks to Boriana for licensing us her artwork as well, because it's a beautiful cover.
It is a great cover. Does it imply that Godzilla did it? Maybe.
That's true. That's true. Godzilla is in the background and there is no crime scene number associating things with Godzilla. So Godzilla might have gotten away with it, to be quite honest. But we're going to go to the next Oscar film that James White wrote, which is The Holdovers. You interviewed the screenwriter, David Hemmingson. He was also in the 16th annual Screenwriting Nominees Q&A. He's great. What was a big takeaway from that article that was fascinating for you?
I've got to admit, that was an interview I was really excited to do because The Holdovers is one of my favorite films of the year, one of my favorite among all the award movies. And David was great. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. He was very, very sort of open with the process. But working with Alexander Payne as a director, there was one fascinating bit where he talked about how things change from script once you get into production. He had written a scene where the main characters interact at a carnival, like a big outdoor carnival, all sorts of games happening, rides, things like that. And basically Alexander Payne had started scouting for locations for this and basically told David Hemmingson, we can't do this. We don't have the budget. I don't have the time to shoot all this stuff. It's going to take me forever to do just a couple of small scenes in a giant carnival like this. Can we come up with an alternative? And so he tasked David with coming up with a list of possibilities. David threw out maybe 6 or 7 possibles. And then he got a phone call from Alexander Payne, who was at a duck pin bowling venue and basically said, hey, duck pin bowling, let's do that. To which David said, duck pin what now? But he basically explained what he was thinking, and David went away a few hours, came back with that entire fantastic scene altered to work in the duckpin bowling venue, and it's one of the really fun scenes of the movie with Paul Giamatti's character, and it's It's great. It's just that wonderful insight into the process of how a writer and a director can really work together to figure out an issue that's going to be something they need to sort out even in production.
The other two Oscar articles James wrote was for Poor Things, and we had the pleasure of having Tony McNamara, the screenwriter, in the 16th Annual Screenwriting Nominees podcast. And for these two articles, James interviewed the cinematographer and the editor. Let's start with the cinematographer. Tell us what was an important takeaway from that article.
Yeah, I got the chance to talk to Robbie Ryan, who is the cinematographer of Poor Things. Obviously, he worked with Yorgos Lanthimos on The Favourite, their previous collaboration, which also had Emma Stone in it as well. Obviously, Emma Stone is the star of Poor Things. I think the biggest thing I got out of talking to Robbie was, and I actually got an exclusive for Backstory. He didn't tell anyone else about this because he'd done a fair amount of press, talking about lenses and stock and everything like that. But one of the things he talked about was a lens called a boroscope. It's that sort of stuff. It's like a funny little gadget that people use. They poke them into engines, and also sort of people who are doing building inspections will poke them around walls and to check for various things inside walls and things like that.
It's like a miniature periscope that you could see inside of things.
It is basically, yeah. And it can be flexible. It can be solid. I learned these things. It can be one of the two. But it's one of the lenses that they actually tested during their extensive camera tests. They tested a number of different lenses to figure out if they wanted to use it in the film. And it was the only one that got through the test process to actually shooting that eventually Yorgos Lanthimos, the director, decided he wasn't really going to use it because it wasn't quite giving him everything he wanted. It was used in one scene. There is one or two shots that stay in, and it's the scene where Emma Stone's Bella Baxter is pointing at a map in Godwin Baxter's house, trying to figure out, well, she's being taught geography essentially, but she tries to figure out where she might want to go. And she points to Lisbon in Portugal, which obviously foreshadows where she goes in the film. But that is the one scene, because what it offered them the ability to do was get really, really close up to her face, but while also keeping a relatively wide angle on it. So that was used for that. It just didn't quite give Robbie or Yorgos what they were looking for, so they didn't really end up using it anywhere else. But I just thought it was fascinating that it was the one thing, because obviously there were camera tests and other things that didn't make it through the testing process, but this did only sort of fail at the final hurdle, as it were, even though, as I say, it is in the film.
You also talked to Yorgos's long collaborator, who is also a Yorgos.
He's actually worked with Lanthimos for 20 plus years now, because he's about 2 decades older than Lanthimos. He was actually working in movies and commercials for a good time before he met with this young sort of whippersnapper upstart. And one thing, well, there were two things that I really took away from it. One was that meeting Lanthimos and working with him changed Yorgos, the editor's outlook on editing. It really sort of shifted his paradigm a little bit. He began to realize that he wanted to get more of the creative voice in the movies, the way that Yorgos, the director, wanted to do, even when he was working on commercials that were basically written by other people, had to be approved by other people, had a certain message they had to get across. So that was one thing I really appreciated. But the big takeaway from his work on Poor Things was there's one little scene you will probably remember. Those that have seen the movie will remember that there's a scene in the dance hall, and it's like a dinner in a dance hall, and there's a whole scene where Bella starts dancing, and then there is a man in the restaurant who's been winking at her lasciviously and everything like that. And Mark Ruffalo's character really doesn't appreciate that. So he starts fighting with him as Bella is dancing. And as Bella's sort of dancing, she then jumps on the back of this guy that Mark Ruffalo is fighting and starts sort of just getting into the fight herself. And there is a moment where she kicks the camera. Now, I think a lot of editors would have said, oh, we'll obviously need to cut that out because it's a mistake. It's
breaking the fourth wall.
It's breaking the fourth wall. We can't keep it in. But Yorgos decided, both Yorgoses actually decided, we like that. It's going to make an interesting little moment because they don't mind about breaking the fourth wall in that film. It works in that one moment. And also it provided an extra push towards a cut where it then ends up with the character, the guy that on whose back she is, pushes away Ruffalo for a second. It worked out really well. And I just thought that was fascinating that they absolutely decided we'll keep that in.
It was a good cut. And of course, you could read the entire screenplay for Poor Things in our Oscar issue as well. Now, of course, it's our Oscars issue, but we know that it's got to live beyond the Oscars themselves. So we always have non-Oscar content in there. And James, you had a great article on the finale of True Detective Night Country. Tell us about a takeaway from that.
I really enjoyed talking to Issa Lopez about the development of the finale. And one of the things that I really took away from it was actually the interrogation scene that the two detectives, Danvers, played by Jodie Foster, and Evangeline Navarro, played by Callie Rice, was they end up duct taping this scientist, Clark, who was one of the guys who actually survived the corpsicle of the show. If you've seen the show, you know that a load of scientists end up in a corpsicle, and that's the big mystery they've got to solve.
A corpsicle, a popsicle of corpses in the ice. Yes.
Of corpses, which is, I believe, is the real San Francisco treat. This guy actually ended up not, surviving what happens to them. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen the show, but he ends up surviving not becoming part of the corpsicle. But they track him down at a certain point and they've duct taped him to a chair. And what they do is they actually strap and then duct tape headphones to his head, and they make him watch the last agonizing moments of a woman called Annie Kay, who was involved with something to do with the scientists. Again, not going to spoil it. I got from Issa that was inspired directly by a moment in the film Grizzly Man, directed by Werner Herzog, which saw the director tracing the sort of the last days of a guy who was obsessed with bears and ended up dying in the wilderness at the paws, I should say, not the hands of bears. And he's given audio of this bear obsessed guy's last moments to listen to, and you see him on camera reacting to what happens. And that moment directly inspired Issa to have this guy listen to the horrific things that happened to this woman as part of his interrogation. And I thought that was a really fascinating insight into what you can draw from other things you've seen that go into your creative work and create this really sort of fascinating moment.
I mean, if there's somebody that has not seen Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man, you've got to see it. It is just an incredibly crazy documentary. And it's cool to go cross genre here, in which you take something great from a documentary and you put it into what you're working on in a fictional narrative to give it that real life strange feel. So, I mean, it was a great moment, and there's plenty of other stuff to learn from the article, but thanks for sharing that one part with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a great chat. I recommend that True Detective season to anybody, and obviously, I recommend the piece to everybody, because if you really love the finale, you're going to learn some really great stuff.
Well, perfect. Thanks, James. Jeff Bond, it's good to have you join us. Obviously, you wrote 3 Oscar articles for us this issue, and we're going to do them in alphabetical order. When it comes to Maestro, which is first up, you were an editor for Film Score Monthly, so it was a no-brainer to assign you to this, because I know that you're more than familiar with Leonard Bernstein's work. Tell us something that really stayed with you from your article, from even the interview we did with the 16th Annual Screenwriting Nominees Panel podcast that we did. He really always was going to do this as a movie. It didn't really seem like it was ever going to be a series, although I think it easily could have been a great series.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's some people who would argue it should have been a series. People who felt like too many aspects of Bernstein's life was left out of this. So I was kind of trying to ask him, how they wound up with the focus that they did, and then we wound up discussing things that were left out. Yeah, Bradley Cooper wanted the focus to be on the marriage, and I think that the screenwriter had taken numerous approaches to this and wound up having to go back and kind of channel everything through the marriage and how Bernstein's life affected the marriage, how his life choices affected the marriage. What I found interesting is that, Bernstein had a huge kind of political life. He was blacklisted. He got into the fight against AIDS and a lot of other politics. He and his wife were very involved in politics, but they didn't really get that into the movie. Singer was talking about another guy involved with Bernstein who had to, I think, name names to the House Un-American Activities. Apparently, there was a point where someone was actually blackmailing Leonard Bernstein because he was gay. And that was, I think that had actually been filmed, or it was part of the interviews that the guy who wrote his life story did, which they incorporated a lot of those interviews kind of into the film. And there's a point where he and his wife are actually discussing the blackmail, and that didn't wind up getting in, which is, if you think about it, that's a pretty dramatic thing to leave out of the film. But obviously they had to make some very tough choices to keep the focus on the marriage in the movie.
Well, right. And as Josh Singer told us, he had a different version of a script. And when he and the star director, producer, but also co-writer Bradley Cooper met up, they kind of started over together. And that's something that you definitely talk about in your article as well. And I think it's one of the reasons that it did get nominated, in which they kind of realized that they had to pick one lane in which they couldn't do his cradle to grave resume life story. And they picked the lane of the bond between this husband and wife, and how even as he was straying in their very unconventional marriage, he still was coming back to her when she needed him at the end. And there's drama inherent in there because, could he have been there for her more the years where he was kind of straying? It's a very interesting script, and I think it got noticed and got an Oscar nomination for that reason, in which it doesn't give you the version of Leonard Bernstein that you're expecting, but it still paints a very interesting portrait of an artist. So, it's an interesting article, and you got into a lot of that stuff on the side. So it was good to read. Okay, moving on to May, December, you interviewed Sammy Birch and Alex Mechanic. They're a husband and wife team. And May, December got an Oscar nomination for original as well. What was something that stayed with you from that article?
Along the Film Score Monthly line, one of the interesting things about the movie is it uses a score for the earlier film, The Go-Between, and they actually adapt the music for the movie. And one thing I didn't realize, which I learned from talking to Sammy, was that they actually played this music on the set to kind of get them in the mood. And it establishes this kind of weird, semi-melodramatic mood. And it kind of shows you immediately that something's off kilter. And I think how you're supposed to look at the movie, which I think is really interesting. And just the idea that they played that on the set, I think is really fun. And the other thing is that the last scene in the movie, there's almost 3 movies in May, December, because it's about this Mary Kay Letourneau kind of situation, which was
a real life story that the movie was kind of inspired by.
So these people, the fictional characters in the movie, had become notorious in the same way that Mary Kay Letourneau and her much younger husband had. And so a previous sort of Lifetime style movie had been made within the fictional reality of this movie that you hear sort of discussed, and eventually you see, someone watching this on television. Then you have the actual movie May, December, which you were watching. And then at the end, Natalie Portman character, who's an actress and has been studying Julianne Moore's Mary Kay Letourneau character to make a new movie about her. And you see the movie that they are in the process of filming at the end. And Sammy told me that everybody you see in that scene is actually the real crew for May, December, except for the director. The director is actually played by an actor, but everybody else, the real art director and cinematographer and scene, which I thought was great because there's just, like I said, there's just so much film within a film within a film play going on that was just kind of the perfect way to wrap that up.
Going back a second ago to what you were saying about the score, I mean, it is a tone setter. It has the air of a melodrama, and you know that you're watching something that has melodramatic aspects to it, but it's also self-aware because that score is so over the top seeming. And, although this is a Netflix movie, I had the rare opportunity to see it with a crowd in a theater. And it was just funny because it gave people a chance to collectively giggle a little at it and kind of remind themselves what they were watching and how absurd the whole situation was. So talking about that score was great.
It's from I think a 1971 movie, and the movie that it's taken from has kind of thematic similarities to May, December. So it works on all kinds of crazy levels. It's something too where modern movie scores tend to not be terribly thematic. They don't have a melody that jumps out at you. And so just having that element to it immediately sets the audience, kind of off like, wait, what is this? What am I hearing? It gives it a kind of a throwback feeling. It's one of many crazy elements to this movie, which I loved.
And that brings us to Oppenheimer. You and I co-wrote this. At the last minute, we were able to get the cinematographer, Hoyt van Hoytema. And, he's just a amazing cinematographer. And without a doubt, it was just no surprise how cinematography was Oscar nominated for this fine film. What were some of the things that you liked about this article we co-wrote? I guess I would start with, I love the experimental fashion that they had. And they just weren't scared of anything. And I thought it was just fascinating. The major "Are You a Communist?" interview scene, it was a 57-day shoot. I think it took 2 weeks to shoot all that footage. They used a real room that they found in a library that really is that small and stuffy. And they put an IMAX camera in there to really give you that kind of trapped feeling. Whereas most filmmakers, when you have that long of a shoot, would opt for a sound stage so that, you could remove a wall when you need to with an IMAX camera in there. But they went the opposite way. And I really respect that. What was something that stuck with you about the article?
Well, I thought the same thing, that it was interesting to hear him talk about working with Chris Nolan and their whole, hands-on, kind of handcrafted, anti-digital analog approach to things, and his discussions about all the experimentation to shoot these kind of subatomic physics scenes that they had to capture without digital effects. But I also love just him talking about, and he didn't go on at length about it, but he talks about his favorite shot in the movie being the last shot in the movie. It's a movie that is just full of close-ups. That's what's crazy about the fact that it's so much done with IMAX, because you're not looking at giant vistas. You're just looking at the pores on giant faces through almost the entire movie. And there's so many close-ups of Cillian Murphy's, character of Oppenheimer. He's, the center of the movie. He said that the script, was written in first person, which, immediately gave him sort of an idea of how to approach shooting the movie. But that the last shot of Oppenheimer, where he's just said to Albert Einstein that, he thinks we've destroyed the world by, giving the secrets to atomic bombs to everyone. And after looking at, 3 hours of close-ups of faces, there's still enormous impact to that last image because of what's being said. And it really does stick with you in a way that he intended. And he talks about the fact that, it's not just because he composed this great shot. It's how it pays off everything that you've watched, everything that's been built into the movie, from the script and the performances up to that point. So it's teamwork aspect.
When you're going to do close-ups like that, you need a great actor like Cillian Murphy in there to pull it off and to add resonance to it each time. And it's just amazing that was their choice. You have an IMAX camera, you're getting that close on someone's face, and he had really good control of his facial features so that each time it kind of has sometimes a different meaning, but especially in the end, because Hoyt definitely talked about the end shot. We also talked about the differences in subjectivity of color being, first person present for Oppenheimer himself, and then black and white, obviously more his past, kind of third person subjective, and or the viewpoint of a different character, namely Robert Downey Jr.'s character in all those commissions meetings and stuff like that. It's interesting. It was a good interview to have because the cinematography of that film, it has such a filmic subtext for something that, otherwise you worry could be boring, right? Because it's physics, but it's exciting because it's, the making of the Manhattan Project come to life. And as you said, one of the experimental properties that they were using was all the things that they were spinning, and we get into it in the article, but all the things that they were doing to show atoms, to show the ripples of rain, the lenses that they were using. So these articles are kind of favorites of mine because, DP loved talking about which lens they used, which one they had made for them, which one that they're going to probably put on the shelf and never use again. And Hoyt was very forthcoming about his creative process. So I kind of really dug this article as well. Of course, for Backstory readers, we have all of these screenplays in our magazine, so you could read them. They're all contained in one section and are easy to read, and that's the other benefit of being a subscriber. As an editor, I love chasing stories, and I just really won't give up because I just feel an obligation to our readers to get the best story. And I started chasing Godzilla -1 right when it hit theaters, right when I saw it. I saw it as having Oscar potential, but I saw it as a movie that I loved. And we were almost scheduled to the point that they had us write out all of our questions and they were going to get it to a translator. And then all of it stopped. But the movie just kept making money. It kept gaining in popularity with audiences. And I kept checking in with the publicist over and over. And it took me a while to even find the right publicist. this, by the way. And I was so glad that it wound up Oscar nominated for visual effects because that gave us a chance to include it in our Oscar issue. And of course, you could see Godzilla in the image of our cover as well. And so when it came down to sheer Godzilla knowledge and who was the best person to have write this article, although I had fun drafting questions with you, Mr. Bond, I know that you are a Godzilla expert of sorts, and it was great to have you do this article. So tell me something that stuck with you about this article, which I really enjoyed. And if you're a Godzilla geek or even not at all, this is a great article to read because we really got into the creative process here.
I'm a huge Godzilla fan, and this was my favorite movie theater experience in years. I was blown away by this movie. I saw it in IMAX the first time. It was astounding. I actually wish it was nominated for more than it was. I guess Toho Godzilla movies have never been nominated for any Academy Awards before, so this is a huge coup that it got this nomination for visual effects, but I think the cinematography in it and even the screenplay is a pretty terrific screenplay. I mean, not just for a Godzilla movie, it's just a great movie about people in the post-war Japan. What struck me, I talked to Takashi Yamazaki, the director. I never got to speak to the director of a Godzilla movie before, so that was a big thrill. And this guy just seems like a really exciting filmmaker, but he's obviously also a big fan of Godzilla, and I think I'd worked Godzilla into at least one or two earlier projects. You know, one of the things we wanted to ask him was just how he perceived Godzilla as a character. He said that, you know, he thought Godzilla was more of like a divine character, was like godlike, which struck me right away. It's not exactly original to this movie. If you go back to the original Godzilla, there's a Shinto, or what is it, ceremony early in the movie on this island, and you have a character almost sort of playing Godzilla before you see him. So there's always been this kind of idea, and various other Godzilla movies have sort of touched on it, but I really love that idea, especially since as a kid, the first time I heard the name Godzilla, way before I'd ever seen a Godzilla movie, but it sent a chill through me, you know, as a little kid to hear this name of a giant monster that has the word God in it. I thought that was really interesting, and also got to ask him about, you know, there's a character in the movie who appears to die on screen, and spoiler alert, you know, is alive at the end. And I wanted to ask him about, because I think that was probably my one quibble with the movie. I felt they would have had an even more powerful film if they had let this character remain dead. And he said that the lead character is a kamikaze pilot who is suffering through the whole movie because he failed in his duty and blames himself for the deaths of other people. Zaki said that he felt like ultimately he couldn't do this to the lead character, have him suffer through another death. And I thought that was interesting. He said there were very numerous versions of the script where this character or other characters had died or been alive. There were a lot of different versions, but the one that he finally told was probably the most uplifting version of the story that he did.
Saying that it's uplifting is really kind of what part of the secret sauce of it, because it's such a downer of what you see coming before that ending that you're looking and hoping that somebody's going to have a win, because it's post-war Japan. They lost the war. It's a kamikaze pilot who failed in his mission, and then you learn he didn't really fail. He did it on purpose, in which his parents said that it's too much to lose him. Life is precious and they don't want to lose him. And then of course, he comes back and his family's dead anyhow. His neighbors think that one of the many reasons Japan lost the war is literally his fault for not completing his kamikaze mission. Like the stupid ideology that just one more kamikaze mission and they would have won the war. It's not a thing. But yeah, like I think that the ending going the way that it does in this uplifting fashion, although you could say is a hair schmaltzy and requires suspension of disbelief, it's so rewarding as an ending that you really don't want it another way. Like I sometimes think of films after I see them of what I want it the other way, and it's like, no, not on this one. They did it perfectly, and they threw in a special effect on that character's neck that has people guessing as to ways it's going to go in the future. And so it kind of is the perfect ending. But it's also, as a script, a near perfect setup of having a kamikaze pilot as the protagonist for this kind of movie. So there's not enough good things I could say about this. You know, the Visual Effects Society awarded the creator with their award, but who knows for Oscar?
Yeah, it's another interesting aspect of this, because if he wins, you know, he'd be the only director besides Stanley Kubrick to win an award for visual effects. Yeah, the use of the kamikaze pilot, I think, is brilliant. And he had already done a movie about a kamikaze pilot. But when I went into Godzilla -1, I had all I knew was it was set in post-war Japan. I knew nothing about the story. The way that he opens that up, and you realize that it's the lead character is a kamikaze pilot who doesn't go through with his mission, you're immediately drawn into the story. You know, the history of Godzilla films is just like the challenge for every movie. How do you get people involved in the story when main character is 400 feet tall? There has been movies that have centered around, you know, families or you know, there's one about like kind of a guerrilla videographer and stuff. But a lot of times it's like, we're in the anti-Godzilla defense force, you know, and so it's all soldiers and scientists. And this, you know, by far, it's the most humanistic, involving story ever done for a Godzilla movie. Even I would say, counting the original one, which is a terrific classic movie, but this one it is just so much more of an audience picture, I think.
You know, you also in the article talked about Shin Godzilla as being another favorite of yours. And, you know, for folks that have never seen that, you could pretty much rent it online anywhere. And
yeah,
so
Shin Godzilla, it's almost an anti-audience movie in a way, because it's a satire of Japanese bureaucracy.
Right.
And he finds a way. He films the endless meetings, you know, sort of with all the same bravura camera work that he does the action scenes. But it's a brilliant, like, science fiction approach to Godzilla, and I think it's in, you know, probably my top 3. It was my favorite Godzilla movie until -1. So
what's the third? If Shin's number 2, what's
probably
your third?
The third is the original one.
Okay.
And the other one is Godzilla GMK is a 2000 movie, and it's directed by, his last name is Kaneko. He directed the 3 1990s Gamera movies, which are all fantastic too. He's the first person, I think, to show Godzilla creating a mushroom cloud with his atomic breath. And it's in a brilliant sequence. And he's a terrific filmmaker too. And I think that Yamazaki, definitely there's a little bit of influence. He brought a lot of wit and kind of grandeur to you know, putting people in context with Godzilla. There's a sequence in this movie that was and still is one of my all-time favorite Godzilla sequences, where you see Godzilla advancing on a hospital, and they just go inside the hospital, and there's a woman in traction, you know, in the hospital bed, and she sees Godzilla coming toward her, and you just see her getting gradually more and more panicky and screaming, and then finally Godzilla moves past, and she's like breathing the sigh of relief, and then Godzilla's tail just comes through and smashes the hospital. It's like the ultimate, like, nightmare, you know. And you know, if you go through the years of Godzilla, there's a lot of things from just stuff for kids that's fun for kids to things that, you know, adults can chew on too. So it's, you know, it's the longest running movie series with a continuing character of Godzilla. And this movie, Godzilla -1, was made for the 70th anniversary of the series, and they could not have hit a bigger home run than they did with this movie.
Absolutely. I can't wait to see it again. And I'm hoping that somebody just re-releases it, because it also is one of the highest ranked Japanese films at the US box office. Yeah. In which it did so well. And they kept extending its run week after week. It did fantastic. So I hope that it'll kind of get some anniversary or something and come back to theaters for some reason. Everybody that saw it was truly lucky to have seen it, because I still can't wait to see it again.
Yeah, I haven't seen the black and white version, and there's a huge sequence in it that's inspired by Jaws, and I think the reason that made so much money is that it brought back, the kind of thrill of that kind of movie making where you're really involved with characters, fantastic action sequences, fantastic editing that really just puts you alongside these characters and doesn't just bombard you with a bunch of, lame CGI, but actually gives you enough texture to feel like you're watching something real and feel like characters are actually involved in the action that you're watching.
Well, it's a good movie for screenwriters to observe, because it's all about character through action and what you learn about how your characters overcome the challenges physically in front of them. And especially in a Godzilla movie, there's very little you could do. You could try and outsmart Godzilla, but Godzilla is truly a force of nature. And that's why people were so attracted to it, because you see this kamikaze guy who's down on his luck, and then Godzilla makes everything worse. And so it's kind of this existential question. The whole movie he's talking about being haunted by ghosts because he just can't get a break, and unsure what reality even is half the times. There are a lot of levels to the screenplay, and I think people will see a lot in it each time that they watch it, and there's more than just a one-time watch in this movie, which is why it's so great. I'm rooting for it to win this category. So
I absolutely want it.
It's the underdog, but I am definitely rooting for it. And no diss on the beautiful effects of the Creator. They're beautiful in that movie. But
Creator is another movie that was done for a relatively low budget, so it deserves props for that. But I felt like I did not get terribly involved in the story in Creator, and Godzilla was the opposite.
Godzilla is a triumph as to what they did on their budget, without a doubt. And so it'll be interesting to see. Well, Jeff Bond, it was good chatting with you, and I dug your articles, and I know folks who read them in Backstory Magazine will as well. I'll see you in a few minutes in the group chat.
All right, looking forward to it.
We have a brain trust here that we put together. We've got basically the other journalists that you've heard me interview for ones-on-ones. We have Claude Chung, James White, Jeff Bond, and Danny Munso. And we're just going to kind of talk you through our thoughts on the ballot. And we decided to start with Best Original for Screenplay. So we'll go in alphabetical order. Anatomy of a Fall. I think a way to examine is pros, cons, and maybe there are no cons. It's okay if there aren't. But starting with Claude, no pressure on you. Anatomy of a Fall. What do you think? What do you think chance-wise it is for screenplay, and what do you think will resonate with the Academy for this nominee?
I am of the belief that Anatomy of the Fall may have the best chance of winning. It obviously has a lot of respect and admiration from a lot of different groups in the Academy, because Justin Trier is not going to win director and it's not going to win Best Picture, and it's a good script. I think this is the place where Academy can say, let's give it to her. There's a precedent of movies that are in a foreign language or largely in a foreign language, not just get nominated but win. So I think it's either Anatomy of Fall or Holdovers, maybe.
Interesting. All right, we'll get to Holdovers. James, what do you want to add?
I mean, honestly, the way things have been going, Anatomy of a Fall has picked up several screenwriting awards already. Other awards bodies, that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know if honestly the trick of them having it in different languages makes me more impressed and makes me think that might hit people. But at the same time, that could cut some other people out who are like, I don't care about movies in the foreign language. It's it's not in a foreign language, but it's chunks of it are in a foreign language. Yeah, I think he has a good shot. That's the only downside I could see to it, the foreign language stuff. But all right, I think he has a good shot, honestly.
Mr. Bond.
Yeah, I agree. I just watched this last night. I thought it was terrific. And of these four, there's one that I think probably has a better chance, because there's no big box office champions in this list. But Anatomy of the Fall does seem to be getting the most respect and buzz out of these. And it is a very complex story. It's something, honestly, when I started watching it, I was exhausted and ready to fall asleep, and it's long. And I was looking at how much time, I was like, Jesus, I got to watch another hour and 40 minutes of this. But before midway, I was really riveted by it. and given how complicated it is, and it doesn't necessarily have a slam bang, I think it has a powerful ending, but it's probably something people can debate. But of these four, I think it's probably has at least the second best chance.
I can't wait to hear what you think is the first best chance, Mr. Munso.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I think it's going to win. The fact that she got nominated for Best Director, I think, is pretty telling. And Alexander Payne did not. Holdovers would be the other kind of big contender in this.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it is the betting favorite. It did move ahead of Holdovers recently.
Well, we are going to examine each of the 5 films. So when we do get to your personal choice, let us know. The heat of this, you could compare in a way like almost similar to Parasite, in which it's something that's so different, it really captured the imagination of the Academy. People thought that it had a chance for screenplay. I don't think people thought it would get a Best Picture nomination, which it did. And the fact that it did is very telling, again, because it shows how much it did resonate and how much it did make it. And James, what you were saying earlier about it having a foreign language, you're right. In the past, sometimes that would be a detriment to especially a Best Picture nomination, but even for screenwriting. And here, it's clear that the voters did watch it, because if you look at the other possibilities, like this made the list and it made it multiple times. So I mean, I think there is a lot of weight to be given. The other thing that I think it really has going for it in the pro side would be you're talking about voters who themselves are artists, and that fight between the married couple trying to figure out childcare while also working on their art, specifically writing, was such a moment that so many people that are voters could feel it. It felt alive. It felt real. It felt lived in. That I kind of think that's the other secret kind of ammo that movie has over the others, in which it really delivers straight to the gut of the voters. So that's why I think Anatomy has a great chance. But let's go to Holdovers, starting with Munso. What are your pros and cons for Holdovers?
Really, the only con is that it's not Anatomy of a Fall, right? I mean, I think it's a great script. I think you could argue it's got the best characters of the year. I mean, to write 3 incredible, unique characters like that is a pretty amazing achievement. I don't think there's anything really wrong with it in terms of a script.
No.
The story might not be for everyone. I loved it personally. I think Anatomy of a Fall is just a little bit better. If you're comparing the 2 favorites, which we're doing, I think Anatomy of a Fall is just a little bit better and clearly impacted people just a tiny bit more. That's the only negative I would say.
I mean, just to follow what you were saying and inject a slight con, there was a little stupid social media pushback, which I do not take that seriously, to be honest. People saying, oh, the troubles of people at a private school. And it's like, you didn't really watch the whole film, I guess, because these are people that are like being siloed into the school, being scuttled away from their families. They're not living the high life at this school. They're living a very lonely existence, specifically these holdovers who don't even get to see their families. Before we go to Bond, the only other thing I would point out that is it should be pointed out this year, especially of all years, is Holdovers is an interesting choice, right? In which this year there was a little bit of a rough and tumble as to what was considered original and what was considered adapted. And Holdovers, they admitted from the first Q&A that I ever saw, Alexander Payne literally said that he was inspired by this 1930s French film that he hired David Hemmingson, the screenwriter, to do an update of. And it is wild that they did not get called out and put into the adapted category. I don't know if the film's in public domain or what the deal is there, in which they didn't have to get the rights, but even down to the teacher having a weird eye is a part of that film. So this is not like a slight coincidence. This isn't a slight homage. Holdovers is 200% its own thing. Like, it exceeds what the French film was, without a doubt. But to say that it's not part of its DNA is weird. Now, inversely, as we all know, and we're not in adapted yet, Barbie was really campaigning to be part of the original screenplay category. And I thought it was a doomed mission from the beginning. And publicists absolutely did not want to hear that. And I absolutely never got into any of the debates with it online, because I don't care which category it ends up in. I just knew that it wasn't going to make it. And when it didn't make it for original, because there are books, cartoons, home videos, There are comic books. There are there are video games that, like, Barbie is in so many other different formats that if it didn't end up adapted, it would turn on its head the entire concept of things being adapted, especially like video game movies, just for a start. But I think it was correct that Barbie was put into adapted, even though that's not what the filmmakers wanted. And I think it's okay for it to be an adapted because they did such an original adaptation. In the same way that Chris Nolan took a nonfiction book and turned it into a screenplay that has the sense of fictional narrative. So that was the only thing about the holdovers that I felt the need to throw in there, because not everybody knows about that debate and how far it went. And by the way, while we are talking about Oscars today, it should be noted that Barbie did get a WGA nomination for Best Original. So their dream did eventually come true. And that makes the situation even more surreal. But I just wanted to point that out as well. What can I tell you? Mr. Bond, your thoughts on the holdovers?
Well, I think this is the movie I think might have a better shot than Anatomy of a Fall. I honestly thought The Holdovers was beautifully made by people, everyone at the top of their game, but the story and the script, I just thought was something I'd seen 100 times before, was completely predictable. Gruff but lovable teacher meets rebellious but troubled student, and you can see where it's going from the beginning of it. So I would be very disappointed if this won, but it's the kind of sentimental thing that people obviously are already kind of embracing, and I can see it winning on that level alone.
I think it will resonate with older Academy voters for sure.
It looks like a great 70s movie.
Right.
So that
the 70s setting.
As a relic of the 70s myself, that appealed to me, but I just felt like I had seen it all before.
Claude.
I agree with actually that point too, that it is, I think one of its virtues in the eyes of the voters is its sense of familiarity. I'm just thinking, like, where else is Holdovers gonna get it has a chance at anything? And so if those people who think that way, and I'm not necessarily saying people should, that would give it a chance at this one. To the comments earlier about how you saw that people were complaining that it's about a bunch of privileged, private school people. And like, as you said, they totally missed the point. I mean, one of the central ideas of it is this class issue, even among students. And it goes to Giamatti's character's background and his past. So I just dismissed that. But Holdovers, I would not be surprised at all if it won, and it wouldn't make me mad or anything.
Yeah, so you wouldn't break things like Jeff Bond will. So okay, well that's good. A Divine Joy Randolph has a really good chance for Best Supporting Actors.
Yeah. She's got locked.
Yeah, so I mean, like, that's going there. One of the funny things, speaking about the 1970s setting, I've really never written a serious publisher's letter, so I always use it as a place to kind of do a weird letter from one of these movies. And for this issue, I was doing a letter from Harvard kicking Paul Giamatti's character out. It was his expulsion letter, but it was so interesting though, because I just went back to the scenes to just make sure I had the timeline right. He was kicked out of Harvard in fall of 1941. So he was likely kicked out of Harvard because that's 30 years before 1971, which is when the movie takes place. So he was kicked out right before America's entry into the war. And that means Paul Giamatti was also probably a veteran, or maybe he was able to stay at home. But it kind of gave me this whole other side to his character that I was definitely not thinking once about. They mentioned the Vietnam War, which Joy's son died in, and so that made sense, especially for the setting of 1971. It was interesting to just think Giamatti, like, I wonder what he was doing during World War II, but we'll never know. James White.
Do you think with his eye issues, he's going to be right there at the front line? I'm not so sure about that.
Sniper.
Sniper. There we go. Yeah, he hits a load of targets, just not the one he's aiming at. Honestly, I would have to say, I think if any other movie this year has a shot at the original, I think The Holdovers might do it because of that nostalgic sort of wrapped warm blanket type function of the movie. I mean, honestly, I really, really liked it. I would genuinely see it as a movie that I would watch every Christmas. It's that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be the best movie in the world. It doesn't have to be the most original movie in the world. If you want something that's going to give you a certain little emotional kick, then, I'll add it to my list alongside Muppets Christmas Carol and Scrooged and other stuff that I watch every year.
So it's comfort food.
Like it. Yeah, it is comfort food. It's not going to be the most groundbreaking barrier smashing thing in the world. But sometimes people like that. If we know anything about the Oscars, except for when they're feeling like they need to be daring, they're going to go with stuff that they know, that feels comfortable, that feels easy to vote for. And honestly, I think it's easy to vote for. I don't necessarily think it can overpower Anatomy at this point, but we'll see. I'm basically just going on other awards categories so far. I feel like Anatomy has the momentum, but we'll see. I'm willing to be surprised. I would be pleasantly surprised because I'm a big fan of the writer. I'm a big fan of the script.
And of course, we love all these scripts, but I mean, there's only one winner, so we just are kind of like looking at it from that perspective. And we've shown our love for these scripts during the entire award season. The only other thing that I would add for the holdovers is I agree that it's an even, little less than even number 2. I mean, I love it as well, and I think the writing's there, but it could be the craftsmanship that sells it. Because again, when I was writing that letter to get the dates right and everything else, and I was reviewing that scene when Giamatti's character is explaining why he was kicked out of Harvard, there's just like this little moment where he's buying booze in the shop, and he's talking about running over the other student with his car, and he pays for it, and the shopkeeper is kind of like, "Here's your change, killer," or something like that. You hear off screen the cash drawer close and clunk close, and right at that moment you just see Giamatti's differing eyes look up straight at the screen. And it's just kind of that classic old type of editing moment that you don't see in modern films that much anymore. And by old, I mean predating 1970s for sure. So I don't know. There's a lot of things in the DNA of that film that I think clearly did resonate with voters to get as far as it did. And it could surprise us. But again, the way that Anatomy hits the guts for everybody that's creative with kids, and even people that aren't, with kids but are creative, I think that's going to resonate. Obviously, going alphabetical order, next up is Maestro, and it seems like although Jeff Bond wrote the article on it, Danny Munso wanted to start the discussion on it.
I didn't mean to kick us off like that. Yeah, this is not my favorite, to be completely candid. I think Bradley Cooper's incredible in it. I think Carey Mulligan's incredible in it. But if we're just talking about a script, there was just a lot of things I wish were in the movie that weren't there.
Name a couple, by the way.
Oh, you and I have talked about many times they ignore a lot of his career. And while I don't think you need to put everything in there, the fact that if you don't go in there with some baseline knowledge of who he was, you're going to be missing out on a lot of text and subtext going on. I thought that was a missed opportunity. But even beyond the career stuff, I think there's just a lot of emotional stuff that was not addressed between the couple. And I know that's kind of what they were going for. They were going for a lot of subtext, a lot of unsaid things. And usually I like that, but there was just too much in the script for me personally. Too many unanswered questions and unresolved things for me.
My biggest surprise was, as Josh Singer told us at one point, Spielberg was possibly going to make this. I think it was briefly on a list, and there was some Spielberg involvement. And because he made West Side Story, I was just shocked that there wasn't a little something about West Side Story. I agree that a film doesn't need to be a resume. And I think Josh Singer is a great writer, and we interviewed him, and he's just awesome at research. The only unanswered question that I really had was for an audience that might not know his work. They would come away with having watched this movie not having a great understanding of his work beyond his conducting. And conducting was an important part of it. But when I first heard that it was going to appear on Netflix, I kind of wondered if it was going to be a limited series, because that's how complex his life is. That would have given them more time. Mr. Bond, you wrote the article. What are your thoughts on Maestro?
He said that once Bradley Cooper got involved, that what he wanted was the focus on their marriage, and then he had to go back and kind of filter everything through that. I wound up liking this a little bit better, by the second or third time I went through it. I think what they do is, they do sort of assume that you have a working knowledge of his career and his music, and because they bring specific pieces of music in to kind of underscore specific scenes and that add a little extra layer of meaning to it. If they use the rumble music from West Side Story for the couple first kind of starts butting heads. And I thought a lot of it was beautifully done. And it is done in kind of like an abstract, stream of consciousness way, which certainly can be aggravating if you're trying to learn something, if you're right. Trying to, come away with like a real understanding of this guy. If you had nothing to go on, to start with, it could be frustrating. but that, they sort of picked their lane, and there's all sorts of stuff, I discussed with him about his politics and things that he had really explored and written scenes, and it all kind of fell by the wayside. So you could probably make 4 other movies about the guy. I don't know. I mean, it certainly seems like there's been backlash of one form or another against the movie. So it doesn't seem like it's, one of the leading contenders to win this. It's certainly got the highest profile of what we've talked about so far in terms of like a big American production.
It definitely has that. And hilariously, the backlash, it's like online bogus little clouds. Like, they just dissipate, because whatever backlash you could say you've read, it didn't stop it from getting Oscar nominated in multiple categories.
Yeah.
It just didn't. Like, so the respect for what they did was still there. Claude.
First of all, I'm going to make a full confession. I did not finish this movie.
Oh, so like a true Oscar voter.
Yeah, exactly. It was the kind of the Netflix syndrome where I got interrupted by something, and then by the time I was trying to loop back to it, other things were like bigger priorities for me to watch. But I do agree that the acting was what stood out the most for me, the performances. I think that once they kind of picked the marriage to be the focus, and then that other stuff that I too would have liked to have seen addressed in some way narratively was just not going to be there, or just kind of in passing, if at all. Yeah, I mean, it got enough love to get nominations in, some categories, but I don't think the writing is necessarily something that people think, when they think Maestro, they think of the performances. And I think that's relatively speaking the only best shots. But even then, I think Maestro actually is probably 4th on the list of these 5 in this category.
On your list. Okay. That makes sense. And one day you'll finish it, and maybe it'll move up or down. Who knows? The other thing I'll say that we all forgot about it was, I remember when the first picture of Bradley Cooper broke, and the internet was just making fun of it for 24 hours. Like, they couldn't handle his nose. I had no problem with it then. And especially after seeing the movie, I thought the makeup was great. And so, I mean, it's hard to take some of this internet backlash very seriously. James.
I would have to say, if it has a real shot at anything, it probably is a makeup and hairstyling nod. But on the writing front, I got to admit, I went to a screening of it, and I felt like the writing left me a little bit cold. I thought they were both great. It sort of, at the same time, it didn't fall into all the traps, but it did fall into a bit of a trap of this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened. Now, it gave me a lot more context than some more recent biopics that I could talk about people who were big in music, but I still felt like it didn't really engage me the way I wanted to be engaged with it. I felt like they were both very good. The people around them were very good. Just didn't really do it for me in terms of just, oh my God, I'm so impressed with how they managed to. And I realized it's a lot to condense. There was a lot about his career, about his life, about his marriage that you wouldn't be able to squeeze it all into one movie. Like you were saying, Jeff, I think a limited series might have worked in its favor, but it's a great achievement, but it didn't exactly work for me. I wouldn't necessarily put it on, top of my list.
By the way, again, it did get nominated for hair and makeup. After all the internet whining, it got nominated for hair and makeup. The only thing I would say about it, like beyond what's already been said, is the Academy takes Josh Singer and Bradley Cooper very seriously. And they looked at it with different eyes. The reason why I think it got a screenplay nomination was because it saddled what everyone expected to be a cradle to grave type of biopic with just the love between this couple weathering a marriage that was non-traditional at its time. And so it seems to me that like him being there for his wife when she needed him the most, that kind of old Robert McKee thing, that they make fun of perfectly in the movie adaptation of do what you want for the whole movie, but give them a great ending. That's what they're going to remember. It seems like it sticks its landing enough at the end that that's what resonated. So I agree. It's still coming in, below Anatomy of a Fall and Holdovers probably for the category, but it could be one of the surprising wins because, as Bond pointed out, it is kind of the most high profile, American production that gives that feeling of old Oscar biopics that have made it all the way. That would bring us alphabetically to May December, which is the little film that could. And I'm going to say right now, if they gave it to May December, even as a sympathy vote, for what happened with Coyote versus Acme, in which Sammy Birch's script, which is supposed to be so great, has been used as a tax write-off for Warner Brothers, and at this moment in time is said to have, like, they're actively trying to delete copies of it. And it's unclear if the filmmakers even have a good non-time code copy of it. If they gave it to her just for that injustice, I think everybody in the category would still stand up and applaud. Chung, starting with you, going back down the line, your thoughts on May December. I know you wrote the first version of our article in our issue 50, and then Jeff Bond interviewed Sammy and her husband again, Alex, for our Oscar issue. But Claude, May December.
You could kind of tell as the war season progressed that the momentum for May December was kind of really dissipating. Like they thought that Charles Melton might get an Oscar nomination for supporting actor because he'd won so many critics awards. That didn't happen. And
but
then
hold on. It didn't happen because he was robbed. He should have gotten a nomination, I think. I thought he was great.
At least they got. I think the writing was the next best shot at it. So, and it's a really good script. I enjoyed the movie. I can see why some people, it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but I really liked it. I thought it was a very clever kind of approach to what kind of a tabloidy story. It had different levels to it, and Todd Haynes was a perfect director to steer it in that direction. But I think just that whole momentum kind of disappearing does not bode well for its chances on Oscar night. But that is funny that you mentioned the Coyote versus Acme, because that would be just an amazing talking point going forward.
I would love to hear her speech. Yeah. If she wins,
that would be great, but she's not going to burn bridges like that.
Everybody would be on her side, as they already are. Bond, you interviewed Sammy and Alex for our Oscars issue 51. What do you give it? What are your pros and cons?
Well, I'd say it's probably, I don't even want to call it a dark horse. I think it's maybe it might be ahead of Past Lives, although I think that's got possibilities in terms of it being a warm, uplifting human story. This is the opposite of that. This is a movie that I think drives a regular, normal audience crazy. And I've talked to you about this, we're in an era where people not only can't stomach unlovable characters, they can't comprehend them. They don't understand, how can this character be in a movie? I'm supposed to love everybody. Both Natalie Portman and Julianne Moore characters wind up being, kind of brilliantly repellent and do, behave and do things in the movie that you sort of can't believe, but it's very entertaining. This is, I had a similar Netflix experience with this where I started watching it and didn't get what was going on and stopped, and then went back and watched the whole movie, and then I loved it. I think it's easily the most original of the scripts that have this nomination, and I'd love to see it win. But again, I think it's just the characters are off-putting to enough people that I think it would have trouble getting traction on that level.
But truly they're not, because it made it to be one of the 5 nominated films out of the entire year. So, people know what an anti-hero is. I know what you mean, for sure, that some audiences were turned off.
I guess it's the difference between, screenwriters nominating this and the more general audience
of Academy voters. Yeah, I got it. Danny Munso.
I got to be honest. I would have ranked this 4th out of 5th until you brought up Coyote versus Acme. Now, all of a sudden, I really want this to win.
For the speech.
Just so Sammy can go up there and tell everyone what's on her mind. Yeah, I think that would be awesome. Yeah, the movie, I enjoyed it. I don't think I'll ever watch it again. I think it wrestles with some really interesting things about our society. Yeah, I think Charles Melton's character, both on the page and on the screen, is kind of the heartbeat of the film, and that's the character that really makes the movie work for me. There's a lot of people in my life that did not care for it, just candidly. So I am curious, how much momentum the movie really has. It was nominated, which is awesome, but this movie has a lot of big fans and a lot of detractors as well. It's not for everyone.
I'll get to my thoughts on it in a second. James.
Like Danny was saying, the person I lived with, my girlfriend, was not a fan of this. She absolutely hated it. She didn't even want it to exist by the time we were finished watching it.
Really?
Yeah, I think her big issue was she didn't think that this sort of subject was great for a movie. The fact that it has its basis in sort of real life, this real life sort of, situation that happened and everything like that. She just was completely against it. I gotta admit, I didn't vibe with it. I wasn't on the same level as she was, but I thought it was interesting what it was going for. I just don't think it achieved what it thought it achieved. I thought the pulpy sort of tabloidy treatment of it just didn't really work for me. And honestly, of all the scripts that managed to get a nomination, this is, if I had to take one out of the running and put in something else, I think this would be the one I would take out and swap in for something else.
So, Mr. White, what would that something else be?
I don't know. I mean, Madam Web was pretty good.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's missed the cut.
Madam Web reminds me of someone that my mother saw on the Amazon just before.
I'm not sure what I would honestly put in its place right now, but if I had to,
so that it does belong.
If I had to swap one out, it would be one I would swap out of those four. Not to do anything, anything bad against Sammy or anything like that. It's just
Cocaine Bear.
Cocaine Bear got
Cocaine
robbed.
Bear. Yeah,
absolutely.
Bear.
I'm in on that.
Would have made it. Yeah.
Cocaine Bear, like we should pour one out for Cocaine Bear. I had the experience that was a little opposite, of what you guys were talking about with being interrupted watching it streaming. I saw it in the theater and I thought it was riveting. I thought specifically everything your girlfriend hated about it, James, taking a tabloid subject and making a movie that at first has a tabloid feel to it. Like it's trashy. It's seedy. I was all for that. But when you get to the father's character, Melton's character, as you guys had said earlier, as the heartbeat, I completely got the movie because as he's trying to raise his kids, really the scene for me was up on the roof, when he smokes a joint with his high school son and he's never had one before. That's the first time he's gotten to be a normal teenager, possibly, since this entire thing happened. And he was jumped into being a father. It's a dark movie, and it's okay to be a dark movie, I think. And I was actually really glad that the hype that we kept seeing pre-Oscars led to something. And it did get nominated because I thought as a screenplay, there's levels of it that if you watch again, there's some depth there. And of course, her speech would be amazing. So yeah, it'd be great to have her win and see who she thanks and what other things she would have to say. But I know it's a long shot, but it's like the little movie that could. And I was glad. But honestly, speaking of the little movie that could, that brings us next to Past Lives. I was at the Park City Library for its first screening at Sundance. And there's been a few times where I've sat up in my seat and said, this has a chance to go all the way to an Oscar nomination because of its screenplay. And Past Lives did it. And I was so glad that it did. It's such an original movie. It has such an original scope. There's people that have always said, write what you know, but at the same time, everybody has interesting personal experiences, but are they cinematic? Can you bring that depth to them and can you make them entertaining enough that an audience wants to watch it? And, Past Lives just got an Independent Spirit Award. Sling Song has gotten a lot of kudos this award season. James, starting with you, Past Lives.
Well, I will hold my hand up and say, now I will preface this also by saying I was absolutely exhausted when I watched it the first time. I actually fell asleep watching it at home the first time I watched it, but I did go back and completely restart and finish it the whole thing and really, really liked it, really got with the emotional vibe of it. Nothing the movies did wrong. It wasn't slow or boring in any way, shape or form. It was just me. I did really end up enjoying it. I thought it was very deeply, authentically emotional. I thought it just absolutely carried its premise all the way through. I thought the performances were fantastic. And yeah, that script is a real powerhouse, a real quiet powerhouse. It's really, really beautiful in the end. I was really impressed with it. And, it absolutely belongs on this list.
Danny.
When I hinted that there was a movie I liked more than Anatomy of a Fall, it was this one. This is, I think, the best script of the year, honestly. Everything about it is so unflashy. And the fact that it's nominated for Best Picture is absolutely incredible to me, and deservedly so. It's, the most exciting thing they do is get on the Staten Island ferry in the movie. I mean, it's everything about it is not showy. It's so confident in that way. Like it knows what it is and doesn't pretend to be anything else. I found it absolutely riveting from start to finish. It's brilliant.
Jeff.
Yeah, I probably would not have seen this movie, but my wife wanted to watch it, and she loved May December, and this, I think, pressed all her buttons. It was just a nice, uplifting human story. It's beautifully made and acted. I don't even know if I would call it a dark horse because, again, it's just an uplifting human story. It's something people can really embrace.
We've talked about this before, and Claude and I talked about this in our one-on-one about it for Backstory Magazine, in which the script was written in both Korean and English on every page, not just a few pages. Even the scenes that were probably going to be shot in English still had Korean written into them. So it's
Yeah, and it
it's
doesn't
ingrained into it.
the language barrier doesn't seem to be the issue it might have been 10 years ago or whatever.
No, it's not at all. Claude.
Yeah, I mean, like point out, Minari just a couple of years ago got a screenplay nomination, and it's almost all in Korean. I will be the first to admit that, being Korean, it hit me. The movie had an even bigger impact than it might have other, but it's impacted a lot of people who have no specific similarity of background as Celine Song went through. But it's moved them, and it is my favorite movie of the past year, and I do like how it's got a little bit of that thing. It'd be a different vibe, but a little bit of that thing that, like, of the three before movies, before Sunset, where there's that kind of tension all throughout, and it's subtle. They talk about it in bits, but it's really the building the subtext and the context, and then so there is that suspense of emotional suspense, and you care about the characters, and they don't paint the husband as the bad guy in any sense. So it's not like you set up a straw man like a lot of love triangles in movies. Yeah, if I were to pick vote for one script in this category, it would probably be Past Lives, but I think that probably it's gonna like battle holdovers for second place behind Anatomy of a Fall, but who knows?
I think it has a chance to surprise people because if you evaluate it against the other movies, it is the most positive, life-affirming, I don't want to say joyous, but like feel-good movie. Like the other movies each have their darkness. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with their darkness. But like this one, I think it also resonated with younger voters because it's about people that are reconnecting through the internet. And they're FaceTiming a lot. They're doing the video calls. I think that was something that was relatable. And so I don't think the language barrier really added up to anything in this movie at all. In the era where English movies have sound mixed so lame that there's an alarmingly higher amount of people watching films with subtitles on to begin with in English, it's no longer some sort of a gatekeeper issue. No. Like, because people are unfortunately used to it from what I think really is some bad sound mixing in English. So I don't know. Like, I think this could be a big surprise winner because it has so much in the positive aspect going for it. And it really doesn't have a lot in the negative category. It's not that dark. It wouldn't off-put that many people. I was kind of blown away that it made it as far as it did from Sundance, which is always fantastic to see. Okay, so that brings us to Adapted. We've already talked about kind of the faux controversies that were happening earlier. We've talked about the controversies, so now we're ready to talk about the category itself. Mr. Bond has only seen 2 of the 5 movies in this category. So we're going to start with those 2. Yes, he's going to see the other ones. But so we're going to talk about those 2, and then he's probably going to skip out of here because he has another journalistic commitment. So here we go. Barbie, Bond, start with it. Take us down the path. Your pros and cons for Barbie.
Pros, obviously, Greta Gerwig got snubbed for director, so this would be a great way for her to get her revenge for that, and for people to honor her achievement. This was a huge cultural box office and critical hit that everybody loved. I think it's still, in the shadow of Oppenheimer, between the Barbenheimer phenomenon, and I personally, I liked it. I'm glad I saw it. I'm glad it exists. But I really thought it would be a lot sharper, kind of comedically. I didn't find it all that funny.
Really?
It was more like moving. I mean, I found the kind of existential crisis of Barbie more moving than it was funny. It was charming and daffy and lovable, but I wasn't like laughing.
Did you see it in theaters? I've got to ask.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I saw it with a big.
I thought it was hilarious in theaters.
I'm sure I laughed at some things, but I expected it to be a true laugh riot, and maybe that it's the fact that it was more touching than funny is a success.
But isn't that a pro rather than a con?
That's my only sort of criticism.
Okay.
That I expected it to be funnier.
I think that's one of its benefits, not something that's
yeah. I mean, it's a touching, it's moving, which is of course is hugely surprising given what this is. So,
Danny.
Yeah, no, I think the fact that it is moving is a minor miracle. I mean, I'm the biggest Greta Gerwig fan on the planet. Shout out Sacramento, but I never would have thought this movie would be moving in the way that it was. And it was. I have to disagree with Jeff though. This movie's hilarious. This movie is absolutely hilarious.
I agree.
Thing about it.
I think I saw it twice in theaters at least, and people were just dying. I was dying every time, and gender jokes across the board. Like, I love the Ken stuff, but I also love the weird Barbie stuff. And the song "I'm Just a Ken." I'm so glad that Gosling's going to perform it. And his performance, some people were wondering, oh, should he, like, because you could argue that he beat out the May December guy, right, in that category for a nomination, but Gosling was perfect. Like if you look at the way that his face is changing within even the course of a minute, sometimes, like the emotions that he's expressing, it was so comedically well done.
It's just a memorable theatrical experience. Like there's not a lot of movies where you walk out of there. Obviously the movie was great, but I'll remember the crowd, how they reacted to certain things. And that elevates a movie for me, I think.
Yeah.
That the crowd is so into it. And, especially you're seeing Barbie and you don't know what to expect. And you walk out there on this kind of high, or at least I did.
James.
I got to concur with Danny. I found it was hilarious. Jeff, I invite you to a beach off. Just to, see if we can solve this out. But honestly, it purely on a memorable, quotable level. I mean, I can certainly, I'm still making Barbie references to my friends compared to the level of Oppenheimer references I make to my friends, which is not that many.
Yeah.
There's a few. But yeah, I thought Barbie was an outstanding achievement. If I'm truly honest, I can absolutely, to a certain degree, see the argument for it being original, if only because, yes, the dolls exist. Yes, there are a million products associated with it, spin-off animated movies, video games, blah, 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 blah. But the actual invention that Gerwig and Noah Baumbach came up with to talk about the meta consciousness of it all and human rights, femininity, feminism, everything else, I think really absolutely made it work for me on a level that several other movies that are much more highfalutin absolutely did not.
I mean, it's fantastic. Claude.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially that characterization of it as a minor miracle. I mean, just where you start from the premise with the material, but then because when they announced that Greta Gerwig was going to make it with Noah Baumbach, I was like, oh, okay, this would be interesting, versus just some kind of corporate, cash grab. And what they created, I thought the world, the way it played out, the balance of just like entertainment versus, this kind of very serious thematic ideas and stuff like that. I mean, just so impressive. And it was just, and entertaining to boot. Yeah. I mean, I think this could be something if they don't want to give Chris Nolan every Oscar on Oscar night, maybe Barbie has a chance here.
I was blown away, just like you. The announcement, when I first heard it, it was depressing. I was like, God, how do you have a run like the way that Gerwig's had and then go to Barbie? And I thought about it, like, rather than overreact and scream about it on the internet, I was like, you know what? If anyone's going to do it, she's going to bring an original voice to it. And her and Baumbach did. And they did something that is utterly unique, possibly unrepeatable. And like people are saying, oh, I hope there's a sequel. And I can't decide. I'm guessing that, of course, if anyone could do it, they could. I was blown away by how inventive it was. And I think it could be something that has a serious chance of winning because it had a feel-good sense to it. Even though there was a political element that people argued about a lot online, I don't think that translates to shying away from Oscar votes for it. Her not getting nominated for director, I think, was a shame, but I think if this wins for screenplay, it's because this screenplay is so unique. And as the buck stops with me as publisher for Backstory, sorry to all the readers that we did not have a story with Gerwig and Baumbach basically after the minute the strike ended, because they could not talk about it. The strike was on when it came out. We were unable to get them to do anything during the strike, obviously, because that was impossible. But the minute the strike ended, I put in requests and we never got there. For whatever reason, there was just, send me, if you want, really in-depth articles about them talking about the screenplay for Barbie, because aside from pieces in other articles, very small pieces, I haven't been able to find anything as comprehensive. And it's a bummer because there's a lot of questions that I still have about it that I would just love to know their thought process, especially some of the left turns they went down. because there's been some things come out about some of the ideas that they had that were abandoned. And it's just fascinating because, in my opinion, they really did end up making almost all the right choices for that script. And it's amazing. So, all right, the other film that Mr. Bond has seen, and I know that he's going to have to duck out soon, is Oppenheimer. What are your thoughts on Oppenheimer?
I saw it again in the past couple of weeks, and I appreciated it more when I could actually hear the dialogue. I do think it's an achievement, and in terms of the box office, it's far more miraculous that this movie made what it made than Barbie. I mean, Barbie obviously was a commercial prospect. Whether it was going to be what it was or not, it was going to make money. The fact that people were lining up to see this movie is equally miraculous. I think it's this certainly has the momentum. For that very reason, people think it's an important film. It was a big box office critical success. I think it would be hard to beat, and this certainly seems like his year for all the other nominations this got. So I think it's got a good chance of winning.
Danny?
Yeah, I think there's two different conversations, right? Like the Oppenheimer, the film, and Oppenheimer, just the script. I think the film is going to win Best Picture. I think it probably should win Best Picture. The script, I've kind of flipped where I don't think it's going to win this category, actually. And I was kind of seeing it as it's going to sweep everything. And I don't think it's going to win this. I think this is the one it might not win. And from just a writing standpoint, it's still very good. I think it kind of falls behind some of the other nominees, including Barbie, to be honest, in terms of what it achieves on the page. I think turning a thriller out of the Trinity Project, which we all know what happens, is a pretty great achievement. Is that a writing achievement or is that a directing achievement? I think that's debatable. But obviously, we're going to talk about all the other nominees at some point. But Oppenheimer is going to own this night. I don't think it's going to win this award, though.
James?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Danny. It is a good script because I don't think you get a movie like that from a mediocre script. I think it does an awful lot of effective juggling, the different time periods, everything like that, making people talking in one room for a long time interesting is kind of impressive. I think it has a few sort of weird quirks that maybe it could have done with slicing out. I'm not sure we needed to see the I Am Become Death bit, read out while they're in the middle of sex and everything like that. It feels like, how do we get that line in? It's a bit like trying to get, with great power comes great responsibility, and somewhere as Spider-Man's, I don't know, kicking a puppy or something. But yeah, I think Nolan's, a great filmmaker. I think it's a great film. I'd have to concur with everybody else and say I don't think this is winning that category. I think it's winning an awful lot on Oscar night. Probably not this category. I think there are better choices to go for. I don't think it's quite seen as this is one of the it's seen as one of the best scripts of the year. Obviously, it got in, but I don't think it's going to carry it all the way, even given all the love for the movie.
Claude?
Add me to the list of people who think that this will not be part of the Oscar sweep for Oppenheimer, which is going to win Best Picture, which is impressive considering it's a prequel to Godzilla -1. But yeah, Chris Nolan's going to win Best Director. It's not like a Titanic where they just said, James Cameron, you're just not in this category this year. It's a really good adaptation of a big nonfiction tome, covers a lot of ground, and it does have that trademark Chris Nolan, narrative where it's not linear and, there's only so much you could do with it. But I thought it was, jumping around, especially when you're talking about like physics and quantum stuff, that it can work. That makes sense. But I agree that probably it's not the favorite in this category.
I also agree that it probably won't win. You never know with Oscar voters because they just might decide it's Nolan's night and they like to see a sweep, or sometimes they could be rewarding him for past screenplays, going all the way back to his nomination for Memento. Again, it was an enigmatic campaign, kind of like its lead character. For the Oscars, again, as publisher, I apologize, we were not able to interview Mr. Nolan, and it wasn't for lack of trying, to the point the team just stopped responding at a certain point. If you have, great Nolan screenwriting pieces you want to send me that I could read up on it, I've scoured the internet. I can't find them. I've watched the bonus features. I don't feel that any filmmaker needs to in any way, shape, or form defend their work with an interview. I like it when filmmakers enlighten people. And I think that from talking to some Oscar voters, there's some questions that could have been clarified really by just being public about it, about the writing process and his approach to character a little more. And I think that actually could stunt them. I mean, they ran a very conservative campaign. The biggest controversy at one point was going to be when the film came out in Japan. And they made the decision that it won't come out until after the Oscars. Forget voting, till after the Oscars are done. So like it comes out March 29th in Japan, and it'll be interesting to see those reactions. I think on its merits, the structure of writing in the first person was incredible, and it really added an interesting layer. I think the parts of the book that they chose to adapt, especially making Robert Downey Jr.'s character the foil, the antagonist, was very interesting. And I've seen really smart arguments going both ways, not about Downey Jr.'s performances, but about the function of that character and if it succeeded or didn't as an antagonist.
That was my biggest takeaway from the movie, was that I didn't hate Robert Downey Jr. enough. And I felt like I really was supposed to, get my back up about this character, and I never felt it. I think there's a strong argument to be made that it's part of the script.
Right. Him as an antagonist, like his performance was fantastic. Like I've never seen anybody complain about that. It's really more about script function. It's a unique script. It stands out. The film's a unique film. And you're going to see the conversation explode, I believe, again, at least online, of how people interpreted this scene where Oppenheimer itself is haunted by what his work has become. And I think that that's a scene that probably did get the script nominated, in which Nolan made a very specific choice not to show the carnage and death on screen, and showed Oppenheimer himself being haunted in that scene where everybody's applauding, but you're also getting this sense of what could have, in his mind is echoing from Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. I kind of agree that like we're all in consensus. It seems like no one would be surprised if Oppenheimer didn't win screenplay, although it's probably going to take a bunch of other awards home. But at the same time, there's enough unique about it that it could. It'll be interesting to see. So, Mr. Bond, we're at the two films you've seen. We're going to let you go. I know you have an interview coming up that you got to do, and so we're gonna continue without you. But thanks for joining us.
I wish you all good luck. We're all counting on you.
We're going to talk about Bond behind his back, right?
Yes, now we're going to talk about Jeff Bond behind his back, and we're going to start with American Fiction. Getting back to our alphabeticals in this category, we might as well start with Danny Munso. You wrote the cover story for issue 50 for American Fiction. It's a film that you and I both loved. I called you the minute after I saw it at the AFI Fest, and I was blown away by it. And it was another one of those little films that I was so glad made it this far in the award season.
I think this is maybe the only time in our entire friendship where I saw a movie before you did, and I really enjoyed holding that over you for like a month. So
that was great.
For me personally, that was awesome. But I think I talked a lot about it when we, earlier. I will say that this is now the betting favorite to win, which should surprise me.
Over Barbie?
According to the website I visited, yes. So
okay, on the dark web.
Over Barbie, over Oppenheimer, and over Poor Things. That surprised me. I don't know why. I think it is the best script of the group. I think what Cord did was amazing. Again, I talked enough about it. I think everyone knows how I feel about it. But yeah, it seems like he has a real chance of winning, which I got to be honest, I didn't think that going into this.
I'm glad he does. Claude.
Yeah, I agree that I think American Fiction has got momentum, and a lot of people like it. It's a really good movie. People like the story and the characters. I give it a good chance to win it, as I don't think it has much of a chance to win any other category. So, I mean, it'd be nice. And so I think you can make a case for it on its merits. And I think there's a good reason why, in this context of all the other scripts and all the other movies that are nominated, that this is its opportunity to shine.
James.
Yeah, this is one that actually managed to sneak up on me, which is kind of surprising, given that part of my day job involves seeing most of the trailers that come out and kind of knowing that movies are coming out. I'd heard about it. I hadn't had a chance to see a frame of it before I actually got the screener for it. And I watched the screener at home, and I absolutely adored it. I thought it was fantastic. I think it is absolutely one of the best scripts of the year. It's head and shoulders above at least a couple of in its own category, and the performances that come from it are just as great. I thought Cord did an amazing job writing. I thought he brought out absolutely amazing stuff from the likes of, Jeffrey Wright, which is not too surprising, but, across the board. I thought that there wasn't a weak link in that performance. I'm so glad to see someone like Sterling K. Brown nominated, who, I've loved on TV for years, and I've seen some fun movies, but this was, another standout performance from him. It's not a huge character, but he does an awful lot with it. And I thought the script was clever. I thought it was funny. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if that's my white guilt coming through, literally, but it's. I thought it was really, really, really well done. I mean, I appreciate the fact that Claude comes from some of the TV shows I've loved in the past, like Good Place and things like that. You see him having honed his sort of writing skill on that and bringing it to this movie, and I couldn't be more pleased for him. And I think prevailing wind is saying this definitely has a shot to take the Oscar. We'll see. Again, looking at other categories, things it's won, I think it could. I think it has a shot and absolutely will be 150% deserving winner.
So at the 2023 AFI Festival, they had writer-director Robert Townsend moderate the Q&A for American Fiction. And if you don't know, Robert Townsend directed the classic 80s satire Hollywood Shuffle. And of course, Cord Jefferson had always been a fan of it as well. And there's many elements that are similar between these two movies. So if you've never seen Hollywood Shuffle, make sure to fix that. Criterion put out a great edition recently. And I even had Robert Townsend in the podcast. But I got to say, it was really cool because Cord Jefferson had never met Robert Townsend. And it was just an awesome Q&A. And you could find it on the American Fiction Awards page. And, for the people that want to get out of the Barbenheimer fracas, like American Fiction is their way out. And there's been, I don't give too much wind to the Oscar prognosticators. Yes, some of them really do talk to Oscar voters. I like that rather than just guessing on their personal preferences. But this does have a chance to break away from the pack because of its originality, especially as an adaptation, because Cord has talked, at least to us, but I know other places, about some of the really interesting choices he made going away from the source material. So while he kept the source material alive, he did still make it its own and still made it cinematic. And so I think that counts too. And James, to what you said about, Sterling, he is, as Cord has said multiple times, part of the heart of the film, because Cord is, through that character reinforcing this part of the book in which he's telling Jeffrey Wright's character Monk to just try and be yourself for once. Because that's what's liberated Sterling's character, is finally, giving up on the lie of his marriage and coming out, trying to live his best life as he can. That's the lesson that Monk really has to learn as well. And that's why that ending between the two brothers is so great. It's definitely one that I think could surprise a lot of people. And it's the underdog that certainly could for this category. That brings us next to Poor Things, good old Tony McNamara, starting with Danny.
Well, this is going to sound like a criticism, and it's not, because I love the script and I love the movie, one of the best of the year. I think if we're just handicapping this category, why it might not win or why it might suffer is I just think the other elements of this movie are so strong that you just don't think of the script first. You think of Emma Stone. Yeah, you think of the visual elements of the movie, which I think are going to win a couple of those categories. Those elements of the movie are so staggering that, and again, I'm not putting the script down, but is this the first thing you think of with this movie? For me, it's just not.
I take the opposite approach on that, in which I thought the script was so original, the characters were so strangely drawn. And even once I started researching what was the original source material and how did Tony change it, like, it is a complex and strange ass story, to the point that it's one of those movies where when you're watching it the first time, it's fun because, actually similar to American Fiction, you are not sure where it's going. And it keeps taking interesting left turns that I was aware of the script the whole time. But I totally get what you mean, because the visual style of the movie is overpowering and sets such a strange world that it does transport you. So I could see that viewpoint. Claude.
Yeah, I really loved Poor Things. And yeah, it was an impressive script adaptation. And I also agree that it falls in the shadow of the, Yorgos's directing and then the performances and even sometimes production design, which isn't fair because it is an impressive scripting achievement. But yeah, I think it's probably one of the least likely to win in this category.
Really?
Yeah, I think, for one thing, I think a lot of people are going to think it's just too weird, which I don't agree with, obviously, but I can see
weird could be good. Like, think about the win for Her, right? For the screenplay Her. Like, that was...
You can't compare the two.
I don't know.
Did Joaquin Phoenix have sex like through a quarter of the movie? I don't think so.
Wait, which version did I see then? Oh, sorry. The sex thing, actually, I was glad never became a crazy talking or arguing point, because you see those dumb diatribes that pop up on the net every couple months about people complaining about sex scenes in movies. They say it's either boring to them, not sexy to them, makes them feel uncomfortable, or has no story function. Here, it was about her evolution. And she was on this path of self-discovery as her brain is maturing, on an incredibly high level based on this experiment that's been performed on her. And I was glad that the sex didn't really add to the controversy of the movie and that it made it all the way to its nomination. But I see what you're saying. I think its weirdness is what people love specifically about the director. And then once they discovered that he did not write it, but he certainly put his fingerprints on it, that, they loved the collaboration between him and Tony because they loved it for The Favorite as well. But I don't know. I think it's a really original script and a crazy adaptation if you consider some of the big lifting he did from, the original source material. Obviously not as big as Nolan did from a nonfiction book, which is still interesting. But James, let's hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this was a fun one for me. I went on a real journey with this. I could almost map my evolution along with Bella's because I sort of started out going, do I hate this? This is so strange and unusual and off-putting in its own way. I kind of see what it's going for. I really love this. So I kind of went on a whole sort of journey along with the film at the same time. I thought it was fantastic. I thought Tony did an amazing job. If you look at the source material, it's all from the men's point of views. And he really turned it into Bella driving the narrative and Bella being the focus of it as opposed to just being the subject everyone is talking about. And I thought it had really interesting things to say about the world and the way the world treats women. I think it's great. I think it might have a shot, but I don't know. I think, like some of you were saying, I think the visual stuff is probably going to overcome that in terms of just actual wins as opposed to nominations.
I love the movie. I can't say enough good things about it, and I was glad for its weirdness. So, I mean, if in the Barbenheimer fracas there's any sort of canceling out and American fiction doesn't leap forward, it would not surprise me at all if Poor Things leapt forward because it's such an original film. And I've loved some of the discourse that I have seen of people comparing it to a sister movie of Barbie. They're both on a similar journey of awakening and awareness. And you could say that, one goes about it in a rated R scenario and one goes about it in a PG-13 scenario, and they both work. And I agree that, Tony's strongest suit here was to really make Bella's voice the voice, which required a huge amount of rewriting from the original source material. That brings us to our final film, Zone of Interest. Danny, starting with you.
Once again, I think this category is really interesting because there's the films that we're talking about, and then there's the screenplays. I think this film is great. Really enjoyed watching it. I didn't see it in the theater, so I don't have that experience. Saw it at home, but was really enthralled the whole time. Is it one of the 5 best adapted screenplays of the year? I don't know about that. You and I have talked offline, Jeff, about how much of a script there even was for this, whether that's debatable or not. I think the movie is phenomenal. The monotony of it, its best attribute. I think it's brilliant. I don't think it's a great screenplay.
It's a strange screenplay for sure. I mean, it's if you look it up and we publish all the screenplays in Backstory Magazine, it's like a tight 76 pages. And I guess I was going to say this later, but I'll just interject it now. I went to a Q&A in LA for one of its earliest screenings, and Jonathan Glazer was there. And it was interesting because he was very forthcoming about his creative process. And he mentioned that sometimes, like he was talking about one of the scenes between the kitchen workers that the wife walks in and out of when they're just preparing the meal in the kitchen. He said he left the camera fixed on them in the kitchen for 30 to 40 minutes, possibly longer, told them what they should talk about and just left, went back to Video Village. And that brings it to like that kind of improv aspect. And so it's interesting because Zone of Interest is adapted because there is a book about it that is nonfiction. And he took an improvisational approach to at least some of the scenes, but not all of them. It's a very strange bird indeed. And I think that's one of the reasons that people were attracted to it. James, let's hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I've got to admit, I went to a screening of this one firmly expecting to like it more than I did. I mean, I'm a fan of Jonathan Glazer. I think he's done some audacious, sort of interesting, fascinating movies. This one, for me, didn't quite do it. I don't know if it was on a thematic level or a bluntly dramatic level. I felt like it was making a point, and it's a point that needs to be made about fascism, about the banality of evil and everything like that. I just feel like it made its point, and the same point, again and again and again and again. And I think it could have been at least half an hour shorter, and I would not have worried about it. So I can't say I was a big fan of this one. I appreciate the ambition. I appreciate the effort that's gone into making it. I appreciate that it is different. It is not like most of the movies you will see this year. But then when you have something like Poor Things, which is also not like a lot of the movies you will see this year, and I love that, I don't think I clicked with the vibe of Zone of Interest. It just did not work for me. But you know what? It's clearly worked for people because it's up for a load of awards. So,
Yeah.
you know, what do I know? I know nothing.
That's why you write for Backstory, James. We love it. Claude.
First, full disclosure, I have not seen Zone of Interest yet. And
Oh, sorry, I forgot there was a Holocaust denier in our group. I had forgotten about this.
yeah, exactly. We will. I'm off to oust some Ivy League presidents.
Yes.
And part of the reason why I didn't make it a bigger priority, I guess, was this kind of discourse, which was what the movie was about, which I read about at the very beginning, the experience of watching it, and I talked to you about it and your experience of it. But it kind of like I've heard a lot of the discourse that kind of covered a lot of the same points, which is that it's it makes its point about, as you said, the banality of evil, and I didn't get the sense from what you and others were telling me that, I mean, a lot of critics went nuts for it, but, a lot of times critics go for a conceptual idea of filmmaking rather than the experience. And I was thinking about the experience of it, and I just couldn't quite get there yet. So, I mean, I will see the movie. I definitely want to see the movie, but that's also why I don't think it's got much of a chance for a
Well, I mean, most movies that Claude Chung hasn't seen don't have a chance to win an Oscar. So I do agree with that concept, basically right from the start. So does James, clearly. I could tell when I was watching it that it was so distinct, with the opening being just pitch black with a scary ass soundtrack of what is perceived as to be voices in an Auschwitz gas chamber, that it really takes hold of you because it forces you into that space for, I think, 5 straight minutes of like no visuals on the screen. And then it contrasts that with the banality of evil for the rest of the movie, or most of it. And, when I was watching it, I was trying to judge, are they beating a dead horse? Like, has the scene gone on too long? Are we seeing too much of the kitchen talk, gardening talk, things like that? So that was something that basically was on my mind. But, the scene at the bottom of the stairs, when he looks at the camera and we flash to Auschwitz modern day, I thought was such an original jump. Even though it seemed 2001: A Space Odyssey inspired, of, young Dave Bowman seeing old Dave Bowman, and they're in the same space and evaluating their lives at different times, to see that and then jump back into the movie was such an interesting element. And to take the audience on this journey through the Holocaust Museum was fascinating as well. So those scenes worked. I think the scene of her mother leaving in the middle of the night because she was so horrified by what was going on the other side of the wall was great. The young Polish girl leaving food for the workers, shot in negative reversal, the opposite of the world we were seeing, I thought was fascinating, and never a word of dialogue from her. It was a fascinating movie. I see why it got nominated. I'm glad that I saw it. But yes, I rank it as probably last in the category to win an award. It was an extraordinary experience. Anyhow, this was a fantastic chat about the Oscar writing categories. And of course, we have no idea how any of these are really going to go until the envelope is open. So we're in the exact same place that you are. And it'll be fascinating to see. Danny, Claude, the ghost of Jeff Bond, of course, James White, thanks for joining us for our first ever Backstory Magazine Roundtable. I love the work that you all do as journalists. I hope our listeners dig this exercise as well. So thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you, Jeff.
Very much. Cheers. Bye.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks to the Backstory Magazine journalists, Associate Editor Danny Munso, Claude Chung, James White, and Jeff Bond. I would also like to, of course, thank the rest of the participants of Backstory Magazine, which includes good old Jonathan Conrad, our art director, and Helene Goldson, our copy editor. Issue 51 is a fantastic issue. You could not only read the articles that we talked about and find more information in them than what we talked about, but you could also read screenplays as well for the Oscar-nominated films. We have almost all of them truly inside the magazine. If you've never read us before, you could check out our free issue at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop, or of course read our iPad app, Backstory. Now, of course, it would mean a lot to me to have my my podcast listeners in iTunes and Spotify, and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks again for considering subscribing to Backstory Magazine. And if you want to, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2024. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to reach out to me, you could feel free to do so at any time. You could find me on X, formerly Twitter, as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. It's those exact same handles over on Instagram, Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. You could also, of course, email backstoryletters@gmail.com, and I will do my best to respond to you. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.